I'm not so good at doing this lefty. I would call us back to order for the afternoon, and we will start with a public comment section. And this is a time when citizens can let us know where what they'd like to say to us and have us be considering. We allocate the 3 minutes for each person, and that we will follow with any clarifying questions that we have, but it's not meant for discussion. It's meant for us to be able to hear what you all have to say, make sure we understood it. And I think we have just one person signed up, maybe two. Judith, did you sign somewhere?
No, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I needed to.
Okay, so let me call up somebody and I'll get this back to you. So the first one will be Lucy Waterbury for Save Our Schools Kentucky. Please come to the front and introduce yourself and let us know what you're doing. And are you being our timer again?
I
as usual?
am.
All right, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Lucy Waterbury. I am a public school parent. I am a public school advocate. I am a warrior for kids. I want to thank you for your service on this board. I serve on a lot of boards myself. Save Our Schools Kentucky is one of those boards. I am our Vice President of Legislative Response. I testified before the Senate Education Committee in regards to House Bill 520. While I have many concerns about charter schools, my biggest concern is how 520 came out of the legislature. To me, it was not how we typically pass legislation in Kentucky. It was not written by LRC. It was written by folks with outside special interest. And this is my concern for Kentucky's public school children, including my own. I serve in site-based decision-making. I make difficult decisions every year regarding staffing. As SEEK funding leaves my building from redistricting, as it did in Fayette County, we lost STEM in my building because of redistricting, because of choices that were made by a redistricting committee. That is the outcome of what happens when SEEK money leaves a building. We have been underfunding our schools for 8 years in Kentucky. And as I heard Hal Heiner speak to what we need to be doing in Kentucky, I agree with him. And as I hear Mr. King speak about where we need to be with our citizens in Kentucky, I agree with you. But we don't have the money being allocated to our schools to make that happen. And right now, if we don't hold the line on the integrity of charter school legislation and regulation, we will lose even more. And it will be our public schools and our disadvantaged schools that lose those children and lose that SEEK funding. I need you as a board, and I'm sorry you're having to deal with this aftermath. I cannot imagine sitting in your position. Being a school-based decision-making council member is hard enough. But we have to make sure we protect our children. If you did not know that there's charter school money that has been used to form a Turkish coup, you don't know enough about charter schools. If you have not been paying attention to what has happened in Tennessee and Ohio and Indiana, and massive numbers of high schools being closed by the Indianapolis Public Schools as a result of charter schools, you don't know enough about charter schools. These are my fears for us collectively as a Commonwealth, for my children, but most specifically for the African American, the Latino, the disadvantaged children, the special education children that need our very best efforts. You all have to hold the line to make sure that the rigor is there in the regulations, because the rigor is not necessarily there in the statute. That's where the regulations come in. So I appeal to you to say, please ask these questions. Please ask the important regulatory questions. Are they a 501c3? What does that mean? What does transparency mean? Where is this money coming from? Where is the influence coming from? Please, please do this for our kids, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Question.
Yes, there's a question for you if you want to, Bill.
Yes.
Just a point of clarification. Is this, do you have data or research on this, or is this just your opinion?
You can Google about the Turkish coup, just do FBI charter school investigations. You can look up anything. Ohio, in fact, in the last legislative session, there was an Ohio legislator that had to try and pass legislation to make sure that when charter schools were closing, that the local money was staying local, because it was going back to the states when these buildings were closing, when assets were sold off, because these are the things we don't think about, right? We're so new to this, we don't know what the aftermath is. So even in Ohio, we have representatives that are passing legislation to say, half of this school was built with local money, why is all the money going back to the state? Things that hopefully we will never have to deal with in Kentucky. But, so yes, you can Google that. I mean, you can Google Ohio charter school fraud. You can Google Indiana, Indiana closing public high schools. Yes, it's there. The data is there, for sure. So we just need to make sure that in Kentucky, we don't make those same mistakes.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you for coming to present. And let me do the next speaker would be, I want to get it right, Judith. Judith Bradley with the Jack Be Nimble organization.
Thank you. So the earlier discussion of OAG opinions and the impact of defining or not defining charter schools as LEAs and their obligations really caught my attention, because on September 22nd, this question was definitively and affirmatively answered, at least in the case of Craft and Gatton Academies, anyway, by the Kentucky Attorney General in an opinion which was requested by Senator Julie Rocky Adams, and I have a copy of it for you, and I hope, Dr. Pruitt, that you got my email. You know, sadly, it seems that when these those two schools, in any case, were established, there was little to no discussion about how they were going to serve students with disabilities, among them, in fact, my son. And perhaps, as it often is, that was because there was no thought that a student with disabilities might even qualify, which, as we know, is not the case. As a result, there was no mechanism established to ensure that students with disabilities would, in fact, have the same opportunity for participation and success in those programs. And that's really regrettable. My name is Judith Bradley. As Mary Gwen just shared, I'm the founder and director of a growing national organization called Jack Be Nimble. We have a rapidly expanding network of families, educators, and actually our mission is to make special education work for all. That includes all students, whether or not they have disabilities, all families, all educators, and actually, yes, even all policymakers. We really want to work collaboratively with you guys. Jack Be Nimble and a growing coalition of educational and disability organizations throughout the state and nationally urge you to please consider the 13% of Kentucky students who have disabilities in your thinking in this and every conversation, every discussion. Are these students with disabilities, in fact, entitled to have the same public school choices as all other Kentucky students without giving up their special education services? You know, I hope that your answer would be an emphatic yes, but frankly, that's not been our personal experience, and it's also not the experience of many families who report to us a lot of battles as they are seeking options for their students with disabilities. Too many conversations of equity and access leave out or don't adequately consider their needs. Concerned that that actually seems to be the case in the present discussion because, in fact, they're so invisible that some of the regulations have actually even removed definitions that refer to them. That is very disappointing. Without explicit and specific, deliberate directives regarding not only that they will be served, but exactly how they will be served, these students you're actually burdening these families and their students. The system ought to be fighting on their behalf rather than fighting with them. These issues can, I know I'm out of time, I just one quick thought. These issues can and should be informed by the experiences of other states in which the IDEA has seen abuse of by charter schools seeking to avoid compliance. I know that we're not going to go down that path in the state of Kentucky. I'm sure that we're not, but it must be, in fact, a collaborative, explicit and open dialogue. Thank you for listening, and thanks for all the work that you're doing. I have a copy of it if you want.
Thank you, yes. We
Grant,
can distribute that. Yes, Bill?
I asked her the same question about your source, your resource, or your data that supports this,
My resource and data for what?
that you said the potential for ECE special needs students not being served.
Well, I can share my personal story, and I can also report on the stories that we have collected of 17 families whose students are actually unable to participate in IB and AP classes without being required to give up their special ed plans. And then there are reports from several states definitively sharing those experiences, as well as OCR guidance and OSEP guidance on the matter. So,
Wayne?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for your, for your presentation. The regulations, the statute, and the application all include explicit language about serving kids with disabilities, identified disabilities. What specifically is your concern about the regulation?
well, as just one example, the regulation does not require a charter school to, in fact, provide extracurricular activities. That is a requirement under the IDEA that, in fact, an IEP must address how a student with disabilities will participate in extracurricular. And it often, unfortunately, is not, because frequently the ARC teams themselves, excuse me, the IEP teams are not as well informed as they need to be. But when it is, if that student is then choosing a charter school which doesn't have that option, they're effectively, removed from that opportunity. My other concern is in the situation that we've faced, the definition of what is or is not an LEA has been really fundamental to the question, at least in the case of Kraft and Gatton, which I understand are not charter schools, but perhaps they would be if this law had existed prior when they were being formed. That question informs how they are going to relate to those students. So if there's a choice to apply to and participate in a charter school that is not an LEA and is in fact, has an MOU with a local education authority, is that student then going back to that school for services, or are they still participating in the charter schools, the school of choice that they've selected in their programming? Those are the kinds of questions that families are asking us, and I don't feel qualified to respond, other than I'm asking you to please consider those issues. So I think that although it is great that we are considering the question of ensuring that these new schools will be required to provide services, when a family has to wait for all these things to get sorted out, you are really in effect removing the choice. And I think that that's our concern. So by not having the dialogue up front, we're consuming way more time and energy. And I am urging you again to please instead look at the experience of some other states with respect to this, and let's be intentional in our design, as you've been so carefully crafting the language of the regulations, to ensure that every family has an equal opportunity for success and participation if they are making a choice other than their local public school.
Thank you.
Thank
Any
you.
others? Thanks, Judith.
Thank you.
Okay, that concludes our public comment session. We'll now move to, there was a question of where we were going to place the self-evaluation discussion. We're going to move it back to its original location at the end during internal board, right after internal board business. So we'll move on to the state assessment results and a short overview of that, and have Rhonda Sims come up and lead that with her team.
People along with me today.
Right.
Thank you. Appreciate some time on the agenda, and we've kind of developed what I would call a high-level look at the results. Just to remind you of some changes that have come into play. We've been talking almost exclusively about the future. So in a way, this is sort of a conclusion of the past system. And, but it is important that we at a state level as well as schools and districts look at the results. Now, I have some two key people with me today. Jennifer, you've met and been with before as we've talked about the new. Jennifer Safford is the Director in the Division of Assessment Support. Now, Kevin Hill is much more behind-the-scenes guy. Kevin is the other director in my office, but he is the person with the true data expertise on the running of data. So as I asked him earlier today, I said, Kevin, are you going to, do you want to share the presentation? He said, I'm here for the questions. I'm here for the questions. So, so if you do have data-specific questions, we've brought the right guy to the table with us. But we do want to walk through some information for you and see what questions you have. And again, I will tell you that it's, of course, this was amended to the agenda, so it's a fairly high-level look, but I think we can certainly see that, there are areas to be concerned about. There are areas that present challenges that people need to work toward for improvement, and then there are some areas that are positive as well. So we want to just see what that mix sort of bag of information is this year. Now, I'll remind you, because we've talked so much about the new, that we are in a transition to the new, and you've spent much of your energy and thinking and conversation and work through the work groups and the town halls and superintendents being with you to get us moving forward on that plan for the new and how our state will meet ESSA, and as we've submitted that as part of our plan. But 16-17 students did take assessments. State-required assessments as well as some optional assessments, and we have all of those results available for people to look at. And literally, there is a lot of deep diving into the numbers at a school level that should occur at a district, and then we will certainly want to look deeper here at those numbers as we can kind of identify the schools that will need some continued support, as well as, where some areas of success are that we can learn from. So 16-17, the results are reported. Keep in mind that this year, there's not a formal accountability. We have not turned in a new list to the federal government of schools in any particular classification, but there is local accountability because the minute the paper begins to report and the news media begins to report, and you begin to talk about it in your school councils and your school boards, there is accountability. But it is more local focused accountability. And we obviously want to be very transparent publicly with the information. So 16-17, we've just sort of completed that process in terms of the public reporting. I will remind you that we have a data review cleanup period that started on the day the data became public, and it's a 10-day window. Now, our office, both Jennifer and Kevin, worked very hard to get the cleanup done before we ever get to the first round of public reporting. But there still is a 10-day window for districts to say, we think something is not quite right in our results, or we think students are not appearing correctly, or students are missing, and we're in that midst right now. So as we finalize that data, we'll repost cleaned up information to the web and to communicate to our schools and districts. Now, let's think forward a little bit, though, to a year from now, 17-18. We still have this transition in place. We're still moving forward, closer to the new all the time. What we would ideally like to report in 17-18 is the dashboard that you've seen as part of the new development. If you looked at our school results this year, you saw an image, really a static picture of the dashboard, and a message with Commissioner Pruitt as to here's where we see the future going. Next year, we would like to have that dashboard operational on the pieces we can do. So we still, remember, have some new collections in place for opportunity and access. Also for transition, we have new measures. So we don't immediately have everything that we can model. But what we can model and make active, ideally, we would have that showing up as best we can in the dashboard. And so we have a lot of implementation work that Jennifer's going to be helping manage for the department to get ready for that piece a year from now. Then in 18-19, so when we were getting to fall reporting in 19, it would be fully the new system in place. So as you can see, it's a fairly long transitional period. And I think the key is we have to keep focusing on what's out there publicly, because at the school level, state district level, we need to be making decisions and pushing forward appropriate work to move kids' performance forward in that transition period. So I sort of kind of went right in. Commissioner, you know you can just hop right in at any point.
I will when I'm
We're
ready.
informal here with this, and because we have put this together for you rather quickly. But just to give you a sense of the overview, now I'm going to turn to Jennifer and let you walk you through a few of the details we've been sharing for many months with school level folks as we've trained them for what to expect as this data came out. And so I'll hand you off the little clicker there.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. With the ESSA and the passage of Senate Bill 1, there were multiple changes in reporting that impacted this fall's reporting. So the bill, Senate Bill 1, was enacted under an emergency clause. So it impacted this year. With that, we have multiple pieces that are different. And just as a reminder, the system that we are leaving, the Unbridled Learning Accountability System, had two parts. First, it had the learners component as well as the program review component. Then those two pieces came together for an overall score. So we released this year the learners component that was comprised of achievement, gap, growth at elementary and middle school, college and career readiness at high school, and graduation rate. So those pieces of the learners component were individually reported. We did not pull those pieces together into a learner's score. Additionally, with Senate Bill 1, the schools had the option, the districts had the option to submit their program reviews. Those program reviews were in visual and performing arts and practical living career studies. So the schools and districts had the choice of completing and submitting those pieces into ASSIST. If the schools did decide to submit those scores for program reviews and the districts approved those scores, then those scores will be publicly reported in the school report card. So the elements that were made public were the pieces on the learners component, achievement, gap, growth, college readiness, and graduation rate, as well as those schools and districts program reviews that did submit and then were approved by the district. Now, on May 24th, the announcement came that the schools would not receive the single overall score that combined those pieces of learners and program reviews. So we announced that, as well as there would not be reported classifications or labels. So those classifications that the schools and districts had previously received as distinguished, proficient, or needs improvement school, those were not reported when we went public, as well as the reward status of like a distinguished school or distinguished district. Those labels were not included in this release also. And then the component scores for the next generation learners or the instructional programs were not released if those were not submitted. Now, during the 2016-17 school year, there was an unseasonably warm weather. So the students had completed the assessments for the vast majority of our schools prior to making the announcement that we would not report those labels. So we had a lot of schools that had completed prior to that announcement. So the changes for the assessment includes that they took were the students in elementary and middle schools took a field test with our science assessment. We are in the midst of changing the type of science test, and we had a test of the items, a new design of the test that the students took at elementary and middle schools. So the assessments did not result in performance levels for the students nor for the school or district in science. We did, however, have the students in our alternate assessment program. The students who participated in alternate assessment science did take an operational assessment, and those results were reported this year. Additionally, the Senate Bill 1 required only one on-demand writing assessment per level. So previously, we had 2 assessments at on-demand writing at middle and high school. So the 2 grades were eliminated to reduce the number of on-demand writing assessments. So grade 6 and grade 10 for our regular education students did not take the on-demand. However, we did continue with grades 5, 8, and 11 with on-demand.
I think we can read here, so if you just want to sort of,
Oh.
you're telling us what's already up there.
Okay,
so,
great.
you know, just-
Other changes were in reporting were due to our vendor ACT. So that's they eliminated the score reports, and the growth at the high school was eliminated due to the plan. Also, because the ACT Compass was not offered by KDE, there was a limited number of students who took the Compass. The only student scores that we included for Compass were those that we received from KCTCS. Assessment data that is reported included our reading, math, and again, our science at alternate assessment, social studies, language mechanics, and on-demand writing, as well as the ACT scores and benchmarks. At the high school, we had English 2, biology, algebra 2, and U.S. history, and then our alternate assessment across all of our grades, including our students at high school that took an advanced placement. Now, as Rhonda mentioned, there at the onset of the school report card, the dashboard image is presented, as well as a video of our commissioner speaking about the new future of accountability. But when you do get to the dashboard, past the dashboard, then we have the school report card as it's looked previously. And you can choose the state, the district, the school, and then if you want to dive deeper, we have the data sets that includes all the data and information. And then the accountability tab has also been reduced from the school report card. So previously, between the profile tab and the assessment tab, we've had the accountability tab that included our students that have 100 days, that are enrolled in our schools and district and are accountable to the school that has been in that school for 100 days. The assessment tab includes the students who are enrolled in the school and tested at that school. So that's the difference between those 2 tabs. The accountability tab had the students who are there for 100 days, and the assessment tab had the students who were enrolled and tested at the school.
Quick question. So under the accountability tab before, is that where college career readiness rate was?
The accountability tab had the overall score that included the label of proficient, the distinguished proficient needs improvement, the AMO goal, and any label that they had.
And we're going to, Wayne, I think we'll get to your question in a second because we want to look specifically at a little bit of the data, the high-level data. The accountability tab had, remember there is a college career rate with the bonus, the idea that you get a bonus if students are both college and career ready. And that was never the number that you used as a board for your strategic planning. So the accountability tab showed the data with the bonus. Assessment just shows the results of the assessment. And so the rates show up a little differently. Now, we've got circled on this data sets. And many people use the data sets rather than mining the card itself. because everything is downloadable in spreadsheets and easy to sort and to look for what you want. So the data sets have both 100-day students, what's traditionally been the accountable student, as well as just tested information as well. So at a district level, what I would want to examine, if I'm in a district that has a transient population where kids are moving in and out a lot, I would want to see what's the difference in performance in my students that I tested and my students I actually had 100 days to influence their instruction. And do I see a difference? And then how do I begin to work toward changing that difference if the difference exists? And all that data is available within the data sets to do that work. And Jennifer's group has done quite a bit of work around resources that districts can use to kind of do that, dig down deeper in what's occurring in your school or in your district.
The reason I was asking is I was just looking quickly for CCR numbers, and I thought it used to be under the accountability tab.
Yep, when it-
So you need to get that now from the
From the
data set.
assessment tab, yeah. And so part of it is
in the
we've had to
assessment
help
tab,
people
too,
know.
so if you just
Right,
wanna
and the
go-
assessment tab is still
Assessment tab,
there,
too. Okay.
arranged in the same way. And in the briefing packet, I think we did it both ways, right, Kevin?
Just to clarify, the assessment tab has the tested data. The CCR was in the accountability tab, which is now only available in data sets.
That's
Yeah.
okay. So
Right.
it's not under the assessment tab.
No,
just
it's
in
under the
data.
account, the information about the individual tests show up. But you're right, the actual accountability piece is under that data set, okay? Now, there are 5 big components of learners. So we know that program reviews is you turned it in or you didn't. And we also had the pattern where some schools turned it in, but other schools within a district did not. So all schools in a district had to turn in program review before we would show a district value. And many districts chose to allow their schools to just choose, do you want to turn it in or not? So there was a real mix of that, and that limited our ability then to sort of report a comparison level of data, because some pieces were there for some schools, not for other schools. So we focused back in this reporting more on the assessment results as they relate to the 5 big subgroups of learners and the learners piece. Megan, do you have a I didn't know
No,
if
I
you
guess
had a
I'm just
question.
really, I think there is a bit of this review that's really helpful, but I
Right.
think really
Yeah, and we'll, the next slide, we're going to the data. But we were a little concerned, there have been so many changes, because sometimes people say, well, why can't you compare that? We want to compare that. But every change you put in the system limits sometimes your ability to compare. And so that's why we gave you that sort of high-level look. So, and again, you'll see here, it just kind of spells out what are the big pieces in under each one. But when we look at some of the results and highlights, and I'll just lead with, it is a mixed bag. And in a few minutes, we're going to look at some graphs, some line graphs, and you see it more firmly on those because it's a more visual representation. Most of this has been lifted out of the bigger briefing packet. But, anywhere we've pointed out there's an increase, there's also things not listed where there's a decrease. So, right up front, if the area's not listed, it was something that didn't change or it actually declined a bit. And then a couple times things aren't listed because we had no test there. A test has gone away. So back to the list that Jennifer went through of the changes in the test. So if we didn't have it available, we couldn't report it. So we've had kind of a mix of things to deal with. You can see that the increases there are as low as that 0.8, 0.8 of a point in social studies at middle school, and the greatest change being at writing at elementary and language mechanics. Now, I'll remind you, language mechanics is a multiple choice norm reference test that was purchased through Pearson. And so it's not a Kentucky-produced assessment for the language mechanics. And in the future, as we move forward, remember Senate Bill 1 says tests should be based on Kentucky standards and built with the help of Kentucky educators, which we think is a great improvement. We've done that in various times in various ways in the past.
Senate Bill 1 or not, we were heading that way anyway.
Right, we were kind of headed down that
believe that our tests
path.
are better if we actually have aligned our
Right.
standards and written by the
Right.
people that are
Right,
actually,
And,
doing it. But also, we're changing the intent of some of our tests. I mean, the
Right.
science test is a good example of
right.
It's just a different test. It's not even just a matter of different items, it's a different construct.
And we really are just now getting the results of the field test in to be able to look at it, to build the test for next year at elementary and middle. At high school, we've had the biology. We continued that this year. But then as we move into next year, we'll have a new science biology that's built by Kentucky teachers. And we field tested some, but we'll have to field test some more this year to make that happen. So when we look at GAP, remember there were two ways in this system we looked at GAP. And one piece that's not in this system that is in the new, we've built where can you land in your total performance based on are you closing that gap, are you improving it? Here, it's a reporting out of GAP using two measures. Looking at did you reduce the kids at novice, and the goal is like by 10% a year. That also has a problem, and the measure didn't have statistical significance. And you'll remember as a group, you talked about as we move forward in the future and we look at achievement gap closure, it's important we look, and I think Wayne maybe was the first to mention, effect size, the size of the population. Because in some of our really small schools, 1 or 2 students could sort of significantly change the points that were earned in this calculation. So we've tried to be cautious as we move forward to make sure we have some statistical safeties on top of this, that we're looking for significant change. Now, at a state level, almost all change is significant because it's very large populations of students. That's not true sometimes if you have a really small group of students to look at. So novice reduction, there was improvement here with reading. In reading, we saw the middle school level and the high school level show improvement. All groups had a reduction of novice. They didn't all meet their target of 10%, but they earned some points or credit for reducing. The exception at high school was American Indian, Alaska Native. That's not a real big group for Kentucky, but we have some students that qualify in that group. With mathematics, it's not as strong a performance. But you do at elementary see some groups where it did improve, the percent novice, so they're listed there. There are 3. And at middle school, it improved for disability. So again, if they're not listed there, they didn't improve. They held constant. In some cases, they slid back. Nothing was a huge movement in either direction. You know, we have some that's more promising than others, and we were going to mention the outside tests like advanced placement that we have some data on here as well.
And the novice reduction, you know, the idea is great, and I think our strategies for how we're working with schools is really good. But personally, I've had some issues with how we calculated it. And I shared that with y'all last year, that it was kind of a funky calculation that didn't lend itself to out years. It was fine for first 2 years, but then
Right.
once you get out, it actually starts getting pretty quirky.
As the numbers get smaller and smaller, it gets harder to be stable. Non-duplicated was the other way we looked at GAP. There were 2, they each contributed equally. Non-duplicated, remember, that's putting all students that qualify for a single GAP group or a single group that we report out separately into a super group, what we call the non-duplicated GAP. And here we just looked at, are they increasing percent proficient distinguished? So it was the simple measure and the one we had used until just a few years ago when we added the other. You can see here there's some change and improvement with some areas at each level. Science, that's the end of course at high school, the quality core. But you can also see there's areas missing where there's not improvement in that closure. Now, I think this is where you see it best, though. Generally, and I think in the press release, we use the term the scores are basically flat. I think you see why we call them flat when you put them on a line. You know, you just really don't see a lot of change. You see some, and you see some upticks and some others. Again, we know this is fairly small for a PowerPoint, but it's kind of the best image we could get for you with all the lines being reflected. And I think what you have to think in terms of it as we move to the new system, we're really focusing a lot on how each group is performing. And are you improving that group performance? And so what we have said, Jennifer's been out in front of lots of people and so have I, we have said you have to think about what's in your data now that you can take action on. Because the action can't wait The need is there. You don't want kids sliding farther behind. So looking at how your individual kids are performing and looking at how your groups of students are performing. And then the most important thing, looking at what happens instructionally for those students. What opportunities are there? We've used that term a lot. But what instructional strategies and changes can occur that reach those kids where they are and improve them where you want them to be?
And we're mining the data to find those high spots so that we can go into the schools and start collecting those best practices so we can start spreading those around.
So what was the goal for, I mean, you've got plenty of data up there, but what was the goal in 2012 for proficiency?
There wasn't an end goal in this system.
Is there-
NCLB used the system, the idea of everybody got to 100.
Because when I look online, and we discussed this yesterday a little bit, looking
Sure.
at the college and career readiness, and you can't see because this
Right.
is even smaller than
Yeah, yeah,
yours,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
You look
yeah,
at these
yeah.
graphs, I try to find the data that correlates
end
to
goal.
what the strategic plan had, and I can't find how we've performed.
Sure.
So are we on track? Are we off track? Are we above where we're supposed to be?
I would need to go back and kind of look at what you're looking at, and we can certainly give more clarification. The strategic plan you're talking about moving forward in the future is linked to the new
But
accountability.
the
I'm not
old-
sure what you're
Yeah,
looking
the
at.
old, so just because it's old, right, doesn't
Right.
mean the data's not
No,
relevant.
no, I'd need to, we would need to look at that, those of us with data, to just be sure how it connects. It should connect, but I'm just not familiar with exactly what you're looking at. That's all I'm saying.
Well, you can know that we're off track for any of the proficiency scores
Right.
that have gone down.
That's gone down.
Because we
That's
have
right.
projected
right.
continual improvement.
Right,
Continual
so is
improvement.
it a train wreck or a
Or if
car
they're
wreck,
flat,
though?
they're,
Right.
Right, because to me, it looks like a train wreck if we've got 7 years, sorry, and don't laugh at me, we have 7 years of flat, right?
Right.
Why are we doing anything? We're doing nothing would have gotten us the same result. And I don't mean to be so harsh about it. I just know from a business perspective, when I'm running my business and I see those type of numbers, I have to react and react aggressively
Right.
to do something different. And I know we have a new accountability system, right? The question is, how aggressive can we make a change? Because flat isn't going to work.
I agree.
Good conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're competing in a world where the people you want to emulate are going up every day. So doing better is not only doing better than you did last year, but it's doing better compared to people who are also doing better. And so that just exacerbates the concept that if you're staying flat, you're falling behind.
Yeah, that scares the dickens out of me.
Me too. I'm glad to discuss kind of the details of the data, but these are so bad that the details really don't make much difference.
Yeah. And again, we wanted you to sit in a line because then I think you see what it's been across time. And, you can choose a line. Of course, Asian is the top line at the top, highest performing students. And we have those color coded. You can see that there are some where there has been plateaus and gains, where there's movement up. But also, you're not only concerned with moving up, you want to see it at a better rate, a much better rate, and that's, I think, Joe, part of your point. But you also want to see that the differences are closing as well in the lines.
The other thing I would say to Joe's point, and Mary Gwen and the rest of the board members who've been here for a while, I don't recall the State Board of Education ever setting goals for the performance of the state, the like of which the board did with the adoption of this accountability system.
They existed in delivery.
in delivery targets. And the problem was that there was they weren't aligned with the goals that were given to the schools and districts in terms of the AMO. And so the AMO, which was what we said, the annual measurable objective, which was set really to be consistent with
No child left behind.
No Child Left Behind in our waiver. They said you can't expect the kind of aggressive goals that we set as being realistic for schools to do, and so we had these separate things. So, of course, for the accountability, the schools are going to pay attention to their AMO targets and the aggressive delivery goals that we had asked the boards to pay. You know, some of them did, talk with their superintendent, put that into their superintendent's evaluation, that these are the delivery targets that we actually expect. But very few. So that basic division is one of the reasons why we wanted in this next round to be much more aligned.
They sort of set out on the side and they were reported against, but they didn't determine your overall status.
I'd never heard of them.
And they're still available on the
They're
web.
available in the report card,
Card.
there's a delivery tab, but
Yeah,
But that was one of my issues when I got here. Is
Right.
It was hard to tell because it was like we had 3 different strategic plans going on. So the reason why we did it the way we've done it is so that there's an alignment between them, so that
Right.
when our board talks about goals, we're talking about a specific thing. When local boards talk about goals, they're talking about specific things. So there's a much better alignment throughout the whole system.
No Child Left Behind set the goal at 100, and sad to say, large percentage of schools, not just in Kentucky, went backward with that goal.
and, again, this is elementary. We've pulled just a few here. We're not going to point the numbers, but I want you to look at the pattern. The pattern is consistent. Which group might be slightly trending up or trending above another group. The order of, a way to think about it, the order of the colored bars might change. Always Asian is at the top. Our Asian students are our highest performing students in the state. But the order after that might vary a little bit. Is it all students? Is it white students? Who is at the bottom may vary, or their position compared to each other. But the pattern is pretty constant and looks rather flat. At times you see it ticking up, at other times you see it ticking back down. So
Say,
here's-
Rhonda, the
yeah.
bottom doesn't look like
Yeah.
it varies a whole lot. I mean,
Not
it
a
looks
lot.
like
The
students-
English learners are at the bottom pretty much consistently. I don't know if they're always at the bottom, but I think they are in these 6 that we
ELs and,
prepared for you.
And then African-American students are pretty consistently right above students' English language learners.
And disability, they're usually in that same area.
Well,
So the bottom and the top are not varying much. You're absolutely right.
Well, Dr. Lewis, one of the things that I've always, it's sort of amazed me, and maybe I'll do some research one of these days, is, and I know hundreds, thousands of educators, it looks like the longer that some students, some groups are in school, the worse they get. If you look at them in elementary, they're at one level, and then in high school, they've even dropped back as far as comparison's sake. So
Yeah. Sometimes the gap seems to
there has
widen.
to be a cause, I guess is what I'm saying, and we hadn't found it.
So are you going to show us, so this is elementary.
There's middle.
There's middle.
And you can see middle has a little bit more steadiness up. It's not making great leaps or gains, but it is, the trajectory of the lines are basically moving forward positively. You see a fairly good little change there with students with disabilities. That's the second from the bottom line, so it's kind of a reddish line.
It'd
So
be
you can
pure
see a little bit of
speculation, but
change.
any sense about, I mean, the data in general for middle school was more encouraging than for
Right.
any other category. Any guesses as to why that might be the case?
No, I think that's the importance of actually going out and talking to some schools.
I think there's been
that are
such
seeing the
discussion around
positives.
middle school and how
Right.
middle school for a long time was.
We saw some improvement in
I mean,
math last year.
It was sort of a wasteland in a way. I don't mean that in the negative tone that it just sounded like. But it was just there. And I think that our schools have had a much more, from what I mean, this is more anecdotal, but I think there's been more focus on middle schools. And middle school math, I've been banging that drum since the day I walked in here, that we've got a problem nationally, but especially in Kentucky with middle school math.
I think a real important statement that we need to make regarding this, though, and regarding your comments, Commissioner, is kids and their families don't get any richer from elementary to middle school.
Right.
And so while there's still a whole lot for us to do outside of school, the differences that we're seeing with gains and performance in middle school are evidence of the fact that changing some things in what we do in schooling, aside from anything outside of schooling, can have impact on kids' learning.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Because a lot of times we talk about the outside factors, and the outside factors are extremely important, so I don't want anybody to take that I'm negating that. But this points to the fact that if we change some things in what we do in the classroom, we can impact performance as well.
I've said that all along. I mean, outside factors are rough, but there's too much evidence out there that if we get past, I'm just gonna say it, but get past our own prejudices and bias about who can learn and actually give them the opportunity to do so, we can see a lot greater impact. But we gotta get some folks past that.
One thing I do want to mention too that's different as you move forward is the ELs, our English learners. And so that's reflected with the green line that's pretty consistently, I think, totally consistently in the slides we show at the bottom. Keep in mind that how that's reported, if you've exited EL services, you're not maintained in any kind of reporting. So as you get the child where they're proficient in English, they disappear from the classification. That is an issue, because then constantly, your group is the group that has the most challenge, and the ones you've had success with aren't showing up as part of the group. So we remember, as we've moved forward with the new system, because ESSA allows you to keep monitored students in, you get a better sense of what changes you've made for those individual groups, because you're reflecting them still in the system. So I think that's something to just be mindful of as you look at the EL data. Also, a lot of our students, and I don't remember the amounts, the percentages, and I don't know if Kevin or Jennifer do, a lot of our students exit out of EL services very young, in the very early elementary.
That's correct.
Because they may be in a home where another language is spoken, but they're also totally immersed in English-speaking schools. So typically, kids who are staying longer in EL services have, they're coming in older or with less formal schooling, also maybe no exposure as much to English immersion into English
Yeah, but
language
we
learning.
should not worry, I mean, that's a critical part, excuse me, sorry to cut you off.
No, that's okay.
It's a critical part looking at this data, but I'm looking at Eastern High School in Jefferson County, looking at the number of English learners, right?
Right.
It's that many,
4, until you have some
right?
quiz data.
That's not even a rounding error for the problem we've got.
Right, well, but keep in mind, you're looking at 40,000.
No, I get it.
No, I mean,
but so
out
you
of a cohort
extrapolate that
cohort
out
every
of-
year, you
Out
know,
of
40 to 50.
2,000, right, 4 out
Right.
of 2,000, you do the math, you go, okay, how are we, to Mary Gwen's comment, you raise the graduation rate 1%, you add how many dollars to
Well, the
economy?
attainment rate, which is
The
how many
attainment.
people had degrees, you add $1 billion in Jefferson County.
You know, so we're not gonna raise it by changing the English as the English learners significantly. I'm not saying we neglect them. But when we look at the data, we've got to move the biggest chunk as quick as we can.
I'm looking at this gap group line and seeing that it's not having some plummeting down, but so I am confused by the briefing packet and the chart that's in the commissioner's report to us that shows a 20-point drop in the gap group score in elementary, middle, and from 2016 to 2017. So I'm I don't understand, well, actually, it's a 20-point gain in middle and a 20-point drop in elementary.
I think that's the accountability gap number that back to novice reduction, that flakiness of that calculation. That's the number you're looking at there,
academic
that gap
index.
number. This is actually individual percent proficient distinguished for each individual group, plus the gap group percent proficient distinguished.
So
Two different calculations.
at the risk of
So
At the risk
the
of
real
saying-
question I have is like, should we be terribly concerned about the gap group and how it's performed over this last year? And you're
we
saying
should
no
be
because that's-
terribly concerned, yes, but not necessarily because of these numbers. Because, and here's why I say that, and I don't want to say anything offensive, but this was part of the problem I had with the old system. It was not clear as to what it meant to people. And so when you combine gap to proficiency with novice reduction, and novice reduction has this hokey number. And you either, basically, you get 0 points or you get 100 points for novice reduction. It artificially tells you something about the gap. Sometimes it tells you the gap is better than it is, and sometimes it tells you it's worse. And what we're trying, that's why, for me, it was really important that we get down to just brass tacks of saying, what is it from group to proficiency, and what is it group to group? And not have these other calculations that frankly could hide things. Sometimes hide them for the good, sometimes hide them for the bad.
I think, too, we've talked a lot about change. There's been lots of change. The consistent piece in the system as we're closing out, and that'll be, I think, a consistency moving forward, is what is proficient and distinguished and novice and apprentice, that kid-level score. And this is what this highlights.
Right.
So I think here, when you see the line, and it's not moving in the slope you want to see,
Right.
and you're not seeing enough improvement from one year to the other, and you're not seeing the lines get closer together, that's where you do want to be concerned, and that's where you want to put your focus in energy.
Thank you. Do you have a few more slides on high school?
I'm just going to
High
click
school?
through these. You can just see the pattern is very consistent.
I'm sorry, go back
Yes,
to high
that.
school.
Which one, Bill?
School.
Okay, let me just click through. Here's elementary, middle, high school. You see is really flat with a little up, little down. The better consistency is in middle with reading. Now, math. Look at the clustering of the lines. That says a lot of our groups are having similar problems with mathematics. That's elementary. You do see some declines. Obviously, our Asian population is out there way ahead. Middle school math, similar look, and high school math.
Do you have has anybody said anything about the African Americans in high school math last year? That's 10 points.
I did notice the shift, but we've not had, I don't think, specific, no one specifically brought that up. I really think schools are really just trying
Gray line.
to dig in there about that. I'll mention, we're going to skip over the highlights because we've already talked a bit about that, and you have them in front of you to take away. We do know the grad rate did go up. We have more kids graduating. And, here we have ACT. So ACT, we have more students taking the ACT. There was an increase in every subject. The composite grew more than it had in 5 years, and across the 5-year period, 0.3. That's not a lot, but it's a tight scale with the ACT. It's not a whole lot of place to grow with the ACT. And then I do have more kids hitting the benchmarks that our Kentucky system put in place. I think advanced placement is another one you see some positives. That's another kind of outside confirmation that there are some things moving forward, though we got to examine where they're not. Advanced placement, we had more students taking it. We had more students taking more exams, not just the class, but the exam. We had a greater number of those scoring a 3 or higher. And then I think this was an important because the department found ways to support this, and the commissioner would know more, but more low-income students were able to take the exams. So we had an increase up to 8,500 this year, and that's because we took advantage of the fee waiver reduction, but then also, while that made it a cheaper cost, still somebody needed to pay for that exam. And I think the department found some ways to make that happen.
Yeah, we had a 13.9% increase in the number of low-income students taking the test, and just as importantly, a 13.9% increase in qualifying scores. So, exactly back to your point, low-income kids can learn just as much as anybody else if they're given the right opportunities.
So again, we would say that the same message we've been saying to schools, look at your results, put faces with data. You really need to know who your kids are and how they're performing. And then begin to, you need to think about that taking action through good quality instruction. And that results whether there's an assessment data in general or whether there's a label that's on top of it. Because ultimately, you don't get change because your label might say something. It's what happens with kids in the room every day.
And
That's where the
therein
change happens.
laid the biggest issue, I think, is we had so many people who would go to that accountability tab and they'd see what their label was and they'd never dig deeper.
Right.
That's why the dashboard was such a big deal for me. A couple of things just for the board to know. There are some media outlets who tried to put together their own algorithm and figure out a ranking. I would not look at those because we have found that the data on those are not accurate. number one. Number two, if you drive by schools and see big banners hanging out there, we did not give them those, but we have had some districts that have self-appointed themselves as distinguished and proficient, which I think is a little bit of a problem, considering that when the new accountability system rolls out, there's going to be a lot of explanation people are going to have to do about why they got worse. Because I can tell you, under the new system, we're not going to have a whole lot of people that are going to have 4 and 5s. So just as an FYI, I'm just kind of prepping you for that.
So if a high schooler says they're distinguished, it's not, we did not.
They have
We did
self-appointed themselves as distinguished.
Yeah, we did not do that. Yeah,
Okay.
we did not do that.
We didn't, there were too many unstable factors to be able to give that clarity. The other part, just to be perfectly honest with you, is in the old system, because it was all normative and we had a kind of a cut, and we never changed the cut, it just kind of leads to more people looking like they're, over the line, under the line, whatever. So we just opted this year to say, look, everybody really needs to focus on your achievement. And clearly,
Trend lines.
we need to see that you can look at these numbers and see we've got to do something. I mean, the time of hoping it gets better is past.
I have one more.
Mayor,
Two more, and then we're going to move on.
just real quick, did I hear you say at the very beginning, Rhonda, that you all were going to look at those, not just African American, but those drastic number changes to see if it's real or if it's data?
We need to,
or whatever it is?
we're just beginning to have some analysis of the final results, but we need to look, I think, and that's part of that digging deep of where do you see change and do you see sort of consistent moving forward? And we need to get a sense of school by school. You mentioned one specifically today. We didn't come to you with list of schools or names today. This was more of a general look for the pattern as a state as a whole. But,
Joe?
Okay, if you go back to your charts where it's flatlining, and looking at the school data, right, there seems to be two distinct buckets that we're talking about. We're talking about race, right, be it white, African American, Hispanic, Asian, and that added up to the total number of students and I was looking in Fayette County now, right? That added up to the total number. And then there was English second learners, free, reduced lunch, students with disabilities, and then GAP group, right? The GAP group, a couple things. One is, have we correlated between race and because there's two distinct buckets we're looking at. Have we done
services versus
Have we
race.
looked at, African Americans and in the GAP group, or Asians and in the, the
I see what you're
free-
saying, yeah,
Right, because there's going to be some correlation potentially there.
right.
Then the second thing is the GAP group, when we look at the data, is over half the population. So say, for example, 5,000 students, 2,500 are in the GAP group. And, once again, and I'll probably put some words in Kathy's mouth, right? When I have on my income statement a field, or something labeled other, and it's bigger than a rounding error, I know I need to dig deeper to get to the data. Right, and with 50% being a GAP group and not understanding it, I think that's a significant.
You want to
Well,
mention
Yeah,
who's in
the GAP
gap?
group it includes all those other non-low performing groups. Basically, the free lunch, if you look at the data on those charts, you'll see the free lunch is kind of laid on top of that. So that's the group that drives that. In our new accountability, we've kind of pulled free lunch out of that group.
Right.
So that's one of the issues. You see that the free lunch population is the majority of that population in the GAP group. Now, when you get to a school, you have
vary by school.
populations where they might have 5 African Americans or 2 Hispanics, and they go into that GAP group. It's non-duplicated. And that was the intention, to bring in those all students, to held them accountable as a group. That was the intent of the GAP group.
Remember, in the new system, the
my
GAP
puzzled
group has a
look-
different definition, and then
But wasn't Joe saying if you put them all together, that's still half of your population? Is that what you were saying?
Right
Yeah, but-
here.
Well, and
the-
he's
Because
looking
of
at
the
a
free and
particular
reduced lunch.
school,
Well, I'm
I
looking
think.
at Fayette County, and all students in high school here in this district, they're saying, 2,700, right? And 1,558 are in the GAP group, parentheses, non-duplicated.
It's on duplicated.
So I don't know what that means, and I wouldn't know how to pull data out of that to help fix an issue.
So that's exactly the issue that in this next round of accountability, that when the commissioner says we want to be able to see them reported as a group as well as separated into individual. So the problem with what happened before is if you had several small numbers in a school, you didn't report it at all because if you had to have a certain number, like 10.
That's right.
To be able to report. So by combining them into a gap group, we then actually highlighted that you're not serving these groups well when you put them all together. So it was both and the effort to have the gap group was to be able to count people you wouldn't count otherwise, but then it could give us the ability to hide how individual groups were doing. So that's why we're doing both now.
That's right.
Is that a good?
That's right, that's a very good explanation.
thank you.
Because it's a grain size issue. The gap group is kind of a big grain size.
Right.
At a school level, I still need to know who is feeding to my gap group. And ultimately, who are those individual groups? And then I need to know who is that child, because that's where the change happens.
Right.
And
So we
so
can
it's
look at
that
all of them.
going down. And obviously, we don't indicate, here are the 20 children when we talk in a public way like this. But ultimately, you have to get down to looking at kid services and performance and looking individually. So it's kind of each piece gives you a little finer detail.
So like on those charts, just to be sure you understand, Joe, the gap group line is the average of all the other gap put into one.
It's not the average,
Okay.
it's a non-duplicated, it's the individual students, because a student could be in the African-American and free lunch group,
Gotcha.
and gap group is only
Gotcha.
one.
Right. He goes in one time, but he might, as an individual student, might show up in several of those
Right.
lines individually.
Well, one thing I like to say that, when we get through with all the lines and all the grafting, these young people are not going to be in school forever.
That's right.
When we pass this 12th grade or 16 or wherever it is, where are these people going to be in society? We're living in a 21st century society when we're hearing reports that we got 31% of people here in America can't get jobs or have jobs available, but they are not able to fulfill those jobs. And I'm asking about the classroom and what we are doing right now for as teaching, our curriculum. What are going on in our curriculum? Are we using the same curriculums we've been using for years and years, or are we moving into this new era that we're into? And if right now, if we're at a standstill and we got the gaps that we see right now, we're in trouble as a nation, and that's what I see, and looking ahead of where we're going and how to get the lines and close them up, and the people that we have in school, we got to figure out a way to do that. I know we can come and we can label, we can talk about what's going on, but my thing is, what we going to do about it? That's the question that I'd like to know. We're all able to identify, and we can see that up on the board, and we can do that. But my question is today, what can and what will we do about it?
Yeah, I think if you wanted to be cynical, you could say that we go through this endless cycle where we establish a system of measurement. We follow it for 3 or 4 years. We see that it's not working at all, and so we start another system. And we muddy the water so much because we don't generate consistent horizontal data. We are just continually saying, well, the next 4 years, here's our goal. But you look back and you see that the results have been very similar for a long period of time, and I just want to agree with what Milton said. I think we need to talk about how we get there rather than what we measure, maybe.
It's a great segue to our next, some of our next items. I really
Thank you
felt
all.
like, and I thank you all for, this was my idea that we really had to have a good idea of where we were to look at the assessment results. But thank you, and we'll
Thank
move
you.
on then to
Thank you all.
what we think might make a difference in that. And that is our legislative and our budget priorities. So we're going to, for the sake of time, ask that Robin and Charlie come together with Kevin and Tracy to talk to us both about the budget priorities and the legislative priorities, which, the legislative priorities, the bulk of which are in this budget year, budget priorities. So, and I guess we're going to have, this will be an action item for the budget review, but it is a review item for the legislative priorities, which would come back to us in December for final approval. So I'm not sure exactly how to combine these two, but I guess starting with Robin, and then you all jumping in with what the policy side of that is, and then we'll turn to the ones that are not budget items for you. Does that make sense?
Okay. Just as a quick refresher, we're continuing our discussion on building the biennial budget request. If you remember, we started back in April, and we started talking about process. Then in June, we talked about the baseline budget and what that represents. In August, we introduced the concept of additional budget requests and defined calculations and how that fits into our budget. And so we are now here in October requesting your review and approval of a recommended budget primarily focused on the ABRs, the additional budget request. The reason we need to do that is on the process of submission, we will actually submit our recommended budget to the Office of the State Budget Director on behalf of the Governor's Office, who will then build a executive branch budget on behalf of all executive branch agencies that will be submitted for consideration in the legislative session. So we are on this time frame that we will take your input and feedback today, and we will actually key into a system, and then that goes to the Office of the State Budget Director for consideration by the governor to put in the executive branch budget. At a very high level, just to kind of set context again, a lot of what you're going to hear today, we talked about in the last meeting. We took your advice, guidance, and input, and we've made some revisions to some of the items that you'll see on here, and we'll work quickly through those. But for context purposes, let me just preface the presentation by saying we all know and understand that we are in a challenging fiscal environment here in the Commonwealth. We read about it in the paper every day. We talk about it every day. We've just been through a series of a request for a budget reduction plan. So we all know that dollars are at a point where there are lots of important competing interests. So as we've put together this recommendation, please keep that in context. This is a representation of the needs of K-12 education. This is what we are presenting as the needs of K-12 education in this challenging fiscal environment so that people can make informed decisions based upon our needs. So anytime we do anything we request for funds here on behalf of education, the numbers are really big. It's just part of how when you're trying to take care of 650,000 students and the districts that support them and the teachers and the administrators and everything else, the numbers get big fast. But we say it in the context to be respectful, that we acknowledge there is a challenging fiscal environment, and we realize that by putting this forward, it doesn't mean that everything's going to be funded or accepted, but it's to allow people to make informed decisions based upon our needs. So I'm going to turn it over to Charlie now, and he's going to walk us quickly through our additional budget request, and then Kevin and Tracy can chime in as we have any policy considerations.
Thank you, Robin.
Did you break it?
Has this been used today? I don't know.
I don't know, maybe can Susan push it forward?
There we
There
go.
it is.
It was off.
Okay. Oh, it was
Somebody
off,
was
okay.
conserving batteries. So the first page, we'll talk about this right now for just a moment, and then we'll talk about this at the very end of the presentation as well. So this is a summary of every additional item that we discussed 2 months ago, except we've made 2 adjustments. We took out a line that was related to the cost of charter schools at the recommendation of the board, and we also removed a second, third grade reading assessment. The second grade, the third grade reading assessment may pop up during some budget talk, during some legislative discussions, but it is not included in this document today.
Doesn't mean that it won't be discussed heavily, though.
Correct. Yeah, in a bigger picture,
Yeah.
much bigger than just a third grade reading test. So I'm not going to go through each one of these because I have a slide on each one, but you can see, as Robin suggested at the bottom line, the numbers are big, really big, because, we represent 50,000 teachers, 650,000 students, and 173 districts. It's just a lot. So,
Charlie, I'll save my specific questions when you get to the slide. But a question about this slide. Are these in order of priority?
there is no priority here
There's
except
no
for what
priority
Charlie's
order.
done.
Okay.
So Seek Transportation, talking about priority, this was number one last biennium, okay? And this will support, all this funding goes directly to school districts, and it's within our Seek appropriation. And if you didn't remember from last time, we are currently funded at around 60% of Seek transportation costs for school districts. So this would make it whole. So basically, if this were funded, all this money would go directly to school districts, and it would make their additional costs that they have to put into Seek transportation zero. Currently, they're putting in combined, 173 district-wide, 133 million a year. So it's very underfunded. Last year was about 56 or 7% funded, and the difference is, price of diesel's gone down a little, so that funding proportion goes up a little, but it's still very underfunded.
Charlie, it's very helpful, I think, in each one of these, you could just sort of say, what does this move us from to?
Okay? So this next group, okay, it's a group of items that are contained in Senate Bill 1, that when Senate Bill 1 was passed, it was not funded. I know we spoke just a few moments ago about the college readiness test. Senate Bill 1 contained a requirement to have a second college readiness test for the 10th grade for sophomores. These numbers were derived on the current cost we have in our budget for the ACT test. We have currently drafting an RFP for college readiness that will be competitively bid. The independent alignment study is another piece of the assessment. So this makes sure that another requirement of Senate Bill 1 is to change our standards. So we have to align our test questions so that they meet the same, they're testing the same thing that our students are taught. So they're aligning the standards and the assessment test, the
Why
assessment
is there
questions.
such a big difference between fiscal year 19 and fiscal year 20?
So when we do that, once the standards are done and we take the effort to align them,
Okay.
it just kind of bleeds over into the next year. It's because it's a little bit more than a 12-month process.
It's a startup process.
In assessment, year one's always
Higher
higher
investment.
than year two.
Right.
This is another page that's dedicated to assessment. So we've got test item development and field study. You heard Rhonda talk about that a moment ago. We've done a little bit of that this year with some science stuff. Been very popular in school districts, and so we're rolling that out. It is also a requirement of Senate Bill 1 in sections 4 and 5. You can see these are pretty consistent numbers because this is going to be an ongoing process. The Senate Bill 1 requires us to create these new items, test items, and then we need to have a refresher. So we're doing like a 25% a year test question refreshment. So we will use some of the questions we used in the prior year, but some of them will roll off and new ones will roll on, and we'll continue to develop new questions as time goes on.
A lot of money on assessment.
As I mentioned just a second ago, this is also related to Senate Bill 1 in Section 4. It requires the revision of our academic standards. So we've got a 6-year cycle for that, okay? So the whole group of academic standards are English, language arts, math, health, PE, science, social studies, arts, and world language. All that's going to be in that cycle. You can see these are, although it's a pretty big number, it's relatively small cost to get that done. We're going to reorganize a whole lot of our staff to help with that. So it will cost more, but we don't need more money than this to do it. Industry certifications, it's been a hot topic for the last year or so. So this is going to be able to provide many of our CTE students in both local and state-operated programs with industry certifications, welding, computer programming, nursing, You know, I think there's probably 30 or 40 different series. So we've got, I'm thinking, 40 to 50,000 students that this is going to touch, possibly in local and state maintained, or state-controlled area technology centers. So that many students are eligible to get these certifications. The cost of these certifications range from $5 or $10 for some of the simple ones, and some of the more complex are up to $500. And the requirement in Senate Bill 1 for the state to pay for these. This is a cost estimate based on how many students we think will take it, and then success. You pay for it whether you pass it or not, so.
And these are certification dollars paid to outside agencies?
Yes, whoever is the
Certified.
certifying, like the American Welding Association.
Got it.
or-
That was done without providing the funding. It was another unfunded mandate, right?
Yes, sir. Although I think the department thinks it's a great idea, we just need the money to do it, because it's just a flat cost. We make nothing except process the paperwork on that. School improvement funds, this is kind of a moving target for us. This is a new provision that, in Section 13 of Senate Bill 1, that allows school districts that fall into what used to be priority and focus schools, which are now comprehensive and targeted support schools. When they fall into these categories, they get the option to choose someone other than us, the Department of Education, to give them the support they need to get their academics online. This is based on some averages that we've spent over the years, and there's no way to really predict how many schools will choose that. Just no way to predict, so we've chosen, we estimated 3, and this is funding for 3 each year. And now we're sort of rolling out of the Senate Bill 1 requirements. This is, there are some things in Senate Bill 1 that require us to make changes in our technology systems. So our Munis is our accounting system, and Infinite Campus is our attendance, and a whole lot of other stuff. And we've got some SEEK program stuff that may have some minor changes required by Senate Bill 1, very minor. And then as well as redoing our school report card. You probably looked at it today earlier in the meeting. So this is to accomplish that goal. Charter school funding, this was going to be for Earl and his staff. This is for four people. We've got a director, a grants position, a data position, and an administrative position. Pretty cut and dry there.
Charlie, I like the way you have that worded.
Thank
on
you.
that front, on the front page, a whole lot better than there.
Okay.
That first slide that you have,
Central office support.
Central office support.
Okay.
yeah, that title can be misleading.
Okay.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
We could make those changes. Another item on our list is career and technical education career advisors. So, you know, CTE is very popular now. We're trying to put more emphasis on it and trying to make it more effective. We found a gap, okay? We've got a missing piece between the academic advisors, counselors in our schools, mostly high schools, and then our career advisors, people who can work with the students, the teachers, and industry. So Laura's office is working very closely with the Workforce Investment Board to try to align some things. And these are going to be people who are located in our area technology centers, but work with all of our school districts and the local industry to either get students going in that direction or maybe get our schools to offer the courses that either KCTCS, the universities, or the industry needs.
But also making connections to industry for things like apprenticeships and.
No question, yes, sir.
And co-op and that sort of thing. Robin McCoy, who's our person here that we brought on to help us with counselors, has also been really helpful in working with Laura to help mail this to be more clear about, this isn't to replace counselors, it's actually, you know, a different function.
But this is not in the high school, this is in the career and technical centers?
So since we have those, we want to place them there because we can place them there, but their goal is to work with the high schools and the technical centers and
And how do they
industry.
work with the high schools? What do you mean by that?
So practically speaking, there are 44 high schools that have career centers as well, and we have 53 that are state-controlled. That really is a cluster of courses. I think the minimum is you have to have 5 courses, different courses to qualify, and it's for state-level funding.
But their job is going to be to make outreach to industry right around the schools, to start helping cultivate the relationship to be able to offer work-based learning opportunities, apprenticeships, co-ops, and then working with students that are actually in the school to say, here are your options. You know, if you do, and if you're going to do this, here's a direction you should go, or here's a place you can get an internship. So it's
So how many high schools do we have altogether, and 44 of which will utilize this money? So
Well, it'll be more than 44. It will, so we have 44 that are locally operated area technical centers. Then we have 53 that we actually operate.
And
every high- 53
plus
more.
high schools.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
Right. So they end up being able to touch virtually every high school in the state.
So
Like our
ATC
average area technology center probably serves 4, 5, or 6 school districts,
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
so they have feeders.
It's well over 200 high schools, so it's not just.
200, yeah. Because they all need this.
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
Just saying.
I agree. We felt like this was a good first step.
It sure is.
Industry's really pushing it, so.
This is so good.
And you also saw Rhonda speak up for a moment about advanced placement. So we had a federal funding source for this. It dried up. We filled the gap last year. This is to provide and fulfill the requirements of the statute 16348 that says the state will pay for all AP and IB tests for students. We've never
Basically-
fulfilled that completely.
And last year, basically, we canceled some contracts that had been going for years that I deprioritized and felt like we needed to reprioritize the money toward our low-income kids taking AP exams.
Going back to what Ben and Milton was saying, this is one of those areas that has proven results for some of those same students that we're trying to help.
And just so we're clear, this is $5 million for all kids.
Yes, sir.
We didn't find $5 million in contracts. I wish we had found $5 million. We could have done a lot more, but ours was considerably less than this, than what we were able to
The
find.
at-risk portion is less than $1 million, so, is our estimate, so, really a high priority for us. Kentucky School for the Blind, additionally, we've been really putting a lot of emphasis on giving more supports to KSB and KSD, and I think they're sort of feeling it and doing better academically now than they've ever done before. So this helps them, especially with the teachers and the dormitory staff. Incredible need there in Louisville at Kentucky School for the Blind for this. 11 total positions, $650,000.
And again, a little bit more of an emphasis here on career and technical education,
Yeah,
which
2 of these positions are CTE
Right.
positions.
School for the Blind has actually not gone into that under previous administrations, so
Yep.
we're pushing that a little bit harder now.
We do have some CTE programs at Kentucky School for the Deaf. This is just basically a technology slide, so if you don't remember, we have 2 funding sources for districts on technology. One is we provide their internet connectivity, and that's the first one. We call it KEN, Kentucky Education Network, and we just pay for the internet bills of all school districts. We give them big giant pipes so they can get a whole lot of speed. The second piece is KET's Offers of Assistance, Kentucky Education Technology System. And what that actually does is that is funding that we either provide people support or dollars to districts, and they use that money to buy technology products for their districts and their students.
So this amount covers the 70% increase of the first part and some of the
So
173 million unmet.
Yeah, no, it doesn't get there.
No.
It does not get there. This is a small step in that direction. It does really help with the first one that you pointed out, the 70% increase in internet usage. So even last year, we went from what we thought was, I think it's 75 bytes per second or mega per second. I'm not a technology person. So 75 of those per second to 100, okay, which was a significant increase. We had no idea how popular it would be, and every kid's using different products to get this. Every kid now just about has a laptop or a iPad or some kind of device like that. And that's how people are delivering their information to students now. And kids bring their own devices in a lot of schools too. That's the first piece. Thank you. New Skills for Youth. This is another CTE program. So we were very fortunate. We applied for a grant from the J.P. Morgan Foundation, and we received $1.5 million to, I'm going to say, create regional centers that help provide a group of districts, KCTCS representatives, and business to get that group of people together to form a collaboration to deliver education for the group of students. I think it's going to be semi-modeled after what you've seen produced here, the iLead Academy. A little bit different, but similar to that.
Well, very focused on regional academies, so that different schools come together and are providing students specific pathways to meet the needs of regional industry needs.
The needs in, Western Kentucky may not be the same as Northern Kentucky. So now we get to some more big numbers here. Preschool, this is our early childhood slide, so we have two covering both preschool and kindergarten on this. So it's been kind of a mainstay in our budget request. It's just a big number and very difficult to attain. But it is the belief of the department and the board that we would like to increase funding for preschool to 200% of poverty level. So it's more money to do that. So it's around $78,500,000 a year for that.
So I have a policy question there. Let me say, first of all, I believe families at 200%, between 161% and 200% of the poverty level are in need. Let me say that first. I'm assuming that accompanying this would be a legislative proposal to increase eligibility from 160 to 200. Here's the strategy question. We know that we're not serving nearly as many kids as we need to serve from 160 and down.
Right.
And so one of the concerns I have, and I don't have a position on this, but I'm really interested in hearing the board's take and your take, Commissioner. One of the concerns I have is you increase it to 200%, then do we just fill the seats in our public preschool with higher income kids, not high income, but higher income kids, instead of reaching those kids at 160 and below that we know we need to get to?
I don't know if this is a corollary, but what we do know from College Promise programs is that when you offer a universal, you actually capture more of the lower income people because suddenly they hear it's for them. And you have a much broader communication effort that this is available. And so it might have that kind of effect here too. The more you can cover, the more the word gets out that this is something, and it becomes more of a cultural acceptance. And so more of the low-income students might actually take advantage. I don't know. I'm just guessing. I'm wondering.
I think it's a maybe. I mean, one of the things that really concerns me, that the big question I have is, I think, and this is just Wayne's guess, I think it's easier to get families from 161 to 200 than it is to get the remaining families that we're not touching from 160 and below.
I think that there's some validity to that. I mean, and this is actually an area that we went back and forth on internally, because arguably we aren't using the current funds enough. To be perfectly honest with you, I think we've got some real problems with some Head Start stuff out there that we won't go into right now, but be glad to share that with you later if you'd like. But I think, part of it for this is also sort of putting the stake in the ground that it's important. And so we felt like we needed to put it here to say, we need to know that if we are going to improve third grade reading, ultimately high school, there's got to be a greater emphasis on elementary. So expanding it to 200%, to me, felt right, but I also think that our districts who are doing this need to have some very explicit outreach strategies for the 0 to 160. So not just y'all come, but what's your strategy for how you're going to reach into the neighborhoods and pull that 0 to 160? And I think the 161 to 200, you may be right. That may be easier. But at the end of the day, I think there's got to be an outreach strategy. One of the things I think that's hard for our districts is because we don't fund preschool or full-day kindergarten. Full-day kindergarten, I think people have embraced. They know that they're going to have to do it. I mean, I've had legislators say, well, we're not going to pay for full-day kindergarten because they're doing it already anyway. True. But I think that there's still folks out there that don't see preschool as connected. They see it as something that somebody else does.
Yeah.
And so part of, I think, what we've got to do is kind of start changing our culture a little bit to be, it's pre-K to 12. I mean, I've got a report from another agency on my desk right now, all the stuff that I'm supposed to do, but I have no real purview over anything below kindergarten. Maybe I should, but, so I guess, part of this is a statement, but in making this statement, if we were to somehow be able to get this extra money, I think what I'm going to push for is that we see a really explicit outreach strategy by our districts to get kids in these.
And we've
preschools.
worked on this stuff before.
Oh, yeah.
I completely support
No, I
the
know, I
statement.
know.
I just really worry, because I think it is easier to get kids at 180, 190, 200. I think you're gonna have parents that are chomping at the bit more so than it's a little bit more of a stretch and takes more engagement, takes getting out there and engaging families and communities at a different level to get those families that are at 100% of the poverty level.
The fact
there any-
is that we do need, those children do need it as well. So I agree that we need the push for all students, but those students between 160 and 200 need it as well.
Ben, you were
Need
next.
to serve them.
I think you could argue that you might get more bang for your buck with the 160 if you could penetrate that group, and if you can't, then this is obviously better. I think for a family of four, you're talking about the difference between 40,000 and 50,000, and a certain number of the people between 40 and 50 are going to be able to take care of that themselves. Most people under the 40 are probably not. I mean, I guess it's a restatement of the obvious to say there's a greater need as the income goes down, but I don't know which one I would, if you could do a better job of penetrating the 160, I would think you might, looking again at closing the achievement gap, there's more achievement gap with the kids under 160 than there is with the kids from 160 to 50 to 200, I think.
Bill and then Kathy.
Are there any movement as far as legislation with preschool that you all know
There's
of?
not been a lot of discussion about preschool or kindergarten. I think the legislature's been very focused on kindergarten, or on pension reform more than anything else right now. We haven't had a lot of discussions about what other initiatives they might want to entertain.
There won't be dollars to do that.
Kathy?
DOA.
I know very little about the whole preschool thing, and and maybe even kindergarten. So if we get money, or the money that we currently have, are parents, are they publicly run schools, or are parents allowed to put kids at the age of 4 in private schools and use state money? No?
No.
And ditto for kindergarten. So what happens if money is appropriated and then we don't have enough students? You know,
goes
like
back
you
to the
say,
coffers.
we're missing this whole group, 160 and below, but there's money appropriated. What happens to that money?
It goes back to the coffers. It expires and goes back into the general fund.
Thank you.
Okay.
And the next piece is full-day kindergarten, and we've sort of touched on that. It's just like transportation. We currently fund it now through the SEEK program at 50%. And that's on purpose, that's not by accident. Okay, we provide that. I think we have more than 140 or 50 districts who provide full-day kindergarten. Okay, they do it out of their own local funds. They think it's important enough to do that. This is a request to fully fund it, $172 million almost, a lot of money. But districts are spending a lot of money. Takes a little bit more to do full-day kindergarten, a lot more student-teacher ratios and stuff are smaller. So have to employ more people.
I think in both the transportation example and the full-day kindergarten, by fully funding those, it really frees up those local funds that are being used to support these two initiatives to be used for other things that districts need to pay for. With continuing shrinking budgets and continuing challenges for local revenues, this is a way to free up those funds to be used for other things, instruction, teachers, all the other
Extended
things that we
school
talked
day,
about.
all that
Yeah.
stuff, yeah.
Or the next slide.
Okay. This is what we talked about. We won't spend any more time on it, but defined calculations are cost of doing business, usually related to the buildings and our people. So retirement costs, health insurance costs, rent, utilities, maintenance pool, motor pool. These are all costs that the department has no control over. It's a number that's assigned by the governor's office when he submits his budget. So these are numbers that are plugged in, and we don't even have all of these numbers yet. We are working on them with the Office of State Budget Director as we speak. It'll be about 30 or 35 million bucks. So, just never available before now. They're still giving us personnel runs, so. So here's a semi-completed sheet, which it doesn't have the defined calculation, so this just kind of shows you how much money we get by fund source. We get around 4.1 million in our general fund, almost 4.1 billion, almost $1 billion in our federal funds, and around 42 million in restricted funds. Restricted funds, once again, are funds that we receive in receipts, like we get money from the Gates Foundation. We probably get 6 or 7 million a year in grants from the Gates Foundation. We get other grants, nowhere near that amount. 20 million of that also is our SEEK program that's dedicated to technical schools. So that's restricted. It's kind of,
And so we have to use that money for those purposes designated.
and every state agency has numbers like that.
And just so we're clear, it says KDE totals, because that's what we have to submit. That's not KDE funds.
Oh, correct, yeah.
Those are, we are less than 1% of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Way, actually, less
We
than
knew
0.5%
Yeah, I
of
think
it.
two-thirds.
Just making sure.
And these numbers do not reflect the rescinding, the reductions that you've been.
Correct.
The reduction plan.
Correct. And those were instructions in the order. We're supposed to submit what we submit. And then if any changes are really ultimately taken, then they'll do it in the governor's office when they submit their budget. And I think that's pretty typical. That's nothing new.
And would that affect the base?
Yes.
Yeah,
Well, we
it
feel
would.
sure that it would. I've not gone on record saying that, but unless future revenue estimates were raised.
And would you put these priorities that are in the ABRs, whatever that is, the
Additional budget requests?
additional budget, would you put those above replacing, should they accept all of your recommended cuts?
It's a
Would you
great
put
question.
these above replacing those?
There are some of these that I would, yes. And but then there are some, but that we are gonna have to find a new way to do at KDE. That we just don't need to put that, we can't put it on districts to shoulder some of the stuff we need to do at the state level. So some of the things that we've got to look at, if we're able to do it, we've got to try to find a way to get it done. But we've got some bigger issues with some of our districts just being able to make payroll, to be honest.
Right. So I went back to this sheet to show you once again, this is where we are. These are the items that we believe are most important that we're currently not funded for. okay? This is all new and different, or at least increases.
Compared to last year's budget, how is this?
I don't have the dollar amounts from last year's on hand, but it's about the same. We were a little bit shorter last year, but we did have the big picture items in here. We did have preschool and kindergarten and transportation,
You're-
big dollar items. We didn't have the Senate
So
Bill 1
he's
stuff.
answering you with what our request was last year. Is that what you're asking? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry.
But we didn't have Senate Bill 1
Right, we didn't have the
last year.
Senate Bill 1 group up there, so that's kind of the biggest change.
Senate Bill 1 was a massive, well, it's more than my annual budget. So,
Do we want to take a look at this from a legislative perspective? Is there anything you would add, in terms of,
So on your, and Susan, you may want to go over to the legislative agenda document. That's divided up into 2 sections, well, 3 sections, actually. And this document is designed to be a document that, if approved by the board, the legislative document is something we would hand out and, to members of the General Assembly as well. So that's why it's organized. It has a lot of information on the first page that you already know, but it's to inform members of the General Assembly about the department, about the board, about the commissioner. That's the first page. The second and third page, you get into what Charlie just went over. And so it's just a repeat of those budget requests. And then in the last part of the document, you're getting into the legislative initiatives, and I'll turn that over to Tracy. These are things that we suggest the board would adopt, that we would, ask the General Assembly to do through legislation. And then there's also a section here on policy priorities that may or may not require legislation, but it's things that the commissioner recommends that be on our plate as far as work over the next 2 years.
So the legislative agenda, as Mr. Brown said, starts off with your all's budget priorities for what you want to see us focus on in the General Assembly. That process is mirrored in the legislative process. So once Ms. Kinney and her office turns over the budget request information to the State Budget Director's office, all of that information also goes to the Legislative Research Commission's budget office, and they begin their own review and preparations for what the General Assembly may want to consider and do on their own or in addition to the governor's budget proposal. Kentucky is one of the handful of states that does a biennial budget request, so we adopt a budget every 2 years, not every year, though we do seem to amend the budget in the short session. This is the long session, though, so they have to adopt a budget for the state to go into effect for the next 2 years. A couple of points that we probably want to go into before we hit the legislative initiatives. First, we are in the interim. The consensus forecasting group was called into action, and that is the group that provides the official revenue estimates for the State Budget Director's office. They're going to meet next Friday, and I expect that they are going to provide updated revenue estimates for this fiscal year. The governor's office had requested all agencies to provide a budget reduction plan in case the shortfall was realized. We've turned that in to the State Budget Director's office for what our budget reduction plan would look like if that has to happen. So I am suspecting that the consensus forecasting group will update the revenue projections for this year to indicate what that shortfall will look like. They will also come back probably in November and December, probably most likely December, to provide revenue estimates for the General Assembly to consider and the State Budget Director's office to consider to base the budget on that moves forward in the session for the next biennium. They will set those new revenue estimates for the next couple of fiscal years as well. There is a pension reform special session coming up the next couple of weeks probably. There's lots of chatter and discussion about what may or may not be in the proposal. The legislature is working with the governor's office to do so. What we're hearing right now is that the plan may be released in the next few days, maybe next week, and then the special session would be called and either at the end of October or early November. There's no discussion at this point of tax reform being included in that call. Right now it's just about pension reform. As Ms. Kinney's already indicated, a big focus for our legislative initiatives and what the budget's been talking about for priorities is the fiscal condition of local districts. The department has spent a great deal of time in local districts with boots on the ground and our staffs working very closely with local district staffs to go over budget reductions, what they're facing. We have a lot of districts facing just tremendous fiscal issues with loss of local revenue, with the unmined coal situation, and just decrease in enrollment and other changes in tax collections, especially in eastern Kentucky. A couple of things that we've been looking at to see if we could provide some relief to districts in these types of situations. One, there's already currently in statute an emergency loan fund. That is currently not funded. It is one of those provisions that have been set up in statute, but the General Assembly has not provided funding for this type of emergency situation. We have been discussing with legislative leadership and provided some language to them about what you could change or amend to the statute to meet particularly the parameters of the current financial situations for the districts, especially in eastern Kentucky, that have lost so much local revenue from the unmined coal situation. There would obviously be parameters on that, and asking for additional funding to actually have money in that to provide some type of cash flow to these districts that are absolutely bottomed out on being able to have any cash flow. The other opportunity that we thought we could provide for local districts is to provide county-to-county merger for insolvency. Currently in statute, there are provisions for independent districts, if they are facing a financial crisis of insolvency, that they can be encouraged or forced to merge into the county district. There are no such provisions for county-wide districts to do that with other county-wide districts. We would like to put into statute language that would mirror that. We have several county districts that are in financial situations, and then they've lost enrollment over time, and they are projected to lose more enrollment over time, that perhaps might be something that we need to have in place for consideration, so that there could be mergers between districts in those types of financial situations. The next thing on the list for legislative initiatives is for the Dyslexia Task Force recommendations that the commissioners had in place for the last year and a half. They've been reviewing how districts are working on dyslexia and related items. The Dyslexia Task Force had a very large list of recommendations. There has been some legislation filed previously about this. In this last year, legislation would have mandated, and it did not pass because it had a fairly large fiscal impact for districts. What we are proposing, and we've shared this legislation with several legislators who've been interested so far, is something that would not create a fiscal impact for local districts or to require them to spend a lot of additional funding, but to try to utilize current resources to help them refocus some of the things that they do around dyslexia. Update and adoption of policy. Dr. Pruitt wants to put in place a pilot project that would allow us to track with 3 districts, urban, rural, and district outside, or middle-sized district, to track what they're doing on dyslexia and try to do something around this issue to bolster it and to help with the reading initiatives that are already in place around dyslexia.
The pilot is for research purposes to expand best practices. We would not do anything for all the other kids in those 3 years. It's just that we would identify 3 specific ones that we would really track, be on the ground with.
This also includes us working even more closely with CCLD, the Center for Collaborative Literacy Development at the University of Kentucky, and also the Council on Post-Secondary Education for additional information to go out in education prep programs. We've already talked about the Career Development Specialist, the additional funding to fund those positions. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit on the policy priorities just a little bit. There's been a lot of discussion in the legislature and obviously in the accountability work groups about essential skills and how that could be incorporated. What the Accountability Steering Committee and the work groups came down with recommending was for the development of a Kentucky Work Ethics Certificate. Obviously, there's a lot of built-in provisions in the accountability system for opportunity and access, and for local districts to provide additional ways and avenues for essential skills to be emphasized, and not just in CTE programming. But this particular recommendation is that that work continues and that work ethics certificate be finalized and included. Obviously, the emphasis there is on high school students as compared to the social and emotional learning. Dr. Pruitt serves on a statewide interagency council of all of the different agencies that touch on children. So CHFS, us, lots of other agencies that in some way connect with a child. They discuss a lot of different issues, and one of the recommendations he made to this group and that we've been working on internally is to really look at social and emotional well-being and learning for students. So, the application of knowledge and to situations, and how do you do that, and how that is applied across different grade levels so that it is age appropriate and specific. That's really been taken to very well. I know that a lot of folks think that there's a little bit of discussion about that in the legislature. Some people want to see the department really just focus on academics, but there are so many other things that hit on a child that can keep them from performing well in schools. And we've seen a lot of those programs have reduced funding, Friskies, other groups that have had some reduced funding over time. And they all connect with keeping the kid in school and hopefully in a well position in the school. So focusing some of those efforts not only within the department but outside with other agencies is what the commissioner is recommending us continue to do. There's no specific legislative proposal around that. There could be legislative proposals that come out of that. I do not know if that would come up for the 2018 session, though. It would be more a collaboration effort at this point. Of the policy priorities that are on there, Dr. Pruitt has been working, and the Office of Teaching and Learning has been working on third grade reading, specifically looking at policies around retention and promotion. There have been several states that have done varieties of looking at how to improve third grade reading scores or your promotion out of third grade for readers and how to improve that overall. The department is looking at that to see what could be done and under what current existing funding streams. We're not wanting to ask for new programs to come online with additional funding because we don't think that will be successful necessarily. The budget request is one thing. Adding new programs doesn't seem to be faring very well, I think, right now in the current environment or conversation. So what the department is looking at is what statutes currently mandate what programs that are dedicated to reading, because some of those have funding streams attached to them. Would we make some of those statutory updates to allow it to be absolutely dedicated to a third grade reading or promotion, retention or promotion initiative, or how would we look at that? We're looking at other states. We're obviously looking at the new results for the reading levels for kids not only in elementary but middle and high school, but this effort is obviously focused on K through 3. Then generally the board has for the last few sessions included a statement of support. They had not done this very often long ago, but in the last 2 or 3 sessions, especially with the continued discussions about tax reform and pension reform, the state board has generally put a statement, and we did on this, and we'd like to know your feedback on this item as well. Just a general statement of support for the governor and for the General Assembly as they tackle the issues. They have not included anything specific about, we want to see you go through the tax expenditure analysis and, do away with $6 billion worth of tax credits. It's nothing that specific, but it is very much, we want to support the governor and the General Assembly in their efforts to try to come up with tenable solutions for the pension system and for continued economic growth for the Commonwealth.
So are there questions on the legislative priorities? My main question is around these policy priorities. If we don't expect them to be legislative, why put them on here? I mean, these things can be done without legislative action.
Well, I think part of it was we just wanted to put them on there as kind of a flag for a few things, because most likely we are going to see legislation around essential skills.
Mm-hmm.
It may or may not be us that drops it, but in our new accountability system, we have committed that we need to do that. So it may very well be a legislative issue, but we want to hopefully make sure that whatever's legislative matches what business and industry matches what our accountability says. The social emotional learning, I'm fine with taking that off. We just thought we would flag that because that is something that more and more people feel like we need to do. And when you see things like, Las Vegas this week and the fact that there's just a lot bubbling around that. The third grade reading initiative is going to require some type of legislation. If we redirect existing funds, the funds that we're looking at doing would require legislation to do that. But this is also a comprehensive package. It's not just about a test.
Mm-hmm.
So we're fine to take those off. This is your document as a board. You can direct us to do that. We just included them because these were some areas that potentially could have some type of legislative impact. But if you want to limit it to just your legislative priorities, it's your document. We're happy to remove those.
I wanted us to think about the legislative priorities in full context but we would like to have a vote on the budget priorities. I had one suggestion in terms of, obviously the budget priorities, these are, as Robin said in the beginning, in the context of, very limited resources, and that everybody is looking for ways to do this. There are a couple of items on here that, to me, are ones that when we've done the research in other countries, that business pays for in other countries. So specifically the industry certifications, the career advisors, things that have to do with workplace learning and work experience might be our new skills. And so I'm throwing out there a suggestion that maybe for us to consider in our legislative priorities, that we actually get specific about a sustainable revenue source for things that we're asking for, that we think are important, that business says is important, that may be a specific levy for those costs that business would underwrite, might be one way to approach that resource question.
A question I have is, looking at the budget requests, where do we tie those back to outcomes? So say, for example, the SEEK transportation, $133 million, how does that move the bar for Kentucky education? What's the, and I'm going to use a business term, what's the payback, what's the payback to our students for doing that?
Great question. So basically, if you're a school superintendent, you're spending, let's say, $10 million a year on transportation, but Charlie's only writing you a check for $5 million, okay? So if this would pass and get funded, I'd write you a check for $10 million.
Yep.
That would free up $5 million more of your dollars to do what your local school board and what you as a superintendent think are most important. Maybe it's preschool.
So how does that change, I'm a simple guy, how does that change graduation rates? How does that change our ability to be work-ready and/or college-ready? And being preschool is really important. I'm not.
Yeah, I just chose that too.
Yeah, I know, you can't get from here to there, right? But how does this change the Commonwealth?
Well, it frees up more funds for us to be able to put into direct instruction, to be able to offer more opportunities. Maybe it allows a school to offer a CTE pathway that they haven't been able to do before.
Perfect. So then what's the outcome from that we can say, we're going to fund this?
Right.
What's the accountability for that to occur? You get an extra $10 million in funding. What's going to happen to your graduation rates? What's going to happen to your test scores? How do we move the bar up?
And this is to say that we're looking at 12 years where we haven't really seen hardly any change at all, regardless of spending. So is money a critical fact? I obviously.
Well, considering there hadn't been any money change in 8 years, I'm just being honest.
Reduction.
And reduction.
But to his
It's to
question, though,
oversimplify it to say that.
do you really, the question, I think, is a really good one, because I am not persuaded, from what I know, that more money equals the kind of outcome that we would like to see.
So the Office of Education Accountability just released a story on, or a report on truancy rates. And one of the biggest and hardest hit areas that we've seen a larger and an increased truancy rate is in eastern Kentucky. We're also seeing a much larger proportion of local revenues that are generated by local boards of education being dedicated to transportation rather than the state's portion of the transportation cost. So there is some correlation about it, where you have to spend your funds because you have to provide transportation for your kids generally. Most districts do. So if you can't even get them to school, some parents will not get their kids to school if there's not a bus that doesn't pick them up.
So that's a perfect example, because there's your payback, right? You say, okay, we're going to give $10 million to Eastern Kentucky for transportation. We're anticipating truancy to get better by 15%, right? You have to, there's some, but then there's an expense and an outcome for that expense. Right, I love that example. It's very well done.
So I'm saying there won't be 173 different plans, but there could possibly be. Could possibly be. Jessamine County may choose to use it on all physics instruction.
Perfect.
Who knows? And they may have that, but each district has a weakness, some financial, some not financial, some academic, and they may choose to use it in different ways. There would be no restrictions on that, no definitive of how a district would have to use that extra
But
freed
would-
up money.
Would they have to get back to you as to what the expected result of that money is?
You know, because this is already a mandate, we should already be providing this money. So I don't think.
Might I suggest a resolution to this is, before us is to approve the budget priorities that are listed here. When we come back with legislative priorities, a possibility might be to try to, in some way, measure an impact that would help us prioritize, that if in our legislative agenda, we wanted to prioritize where these budget, what would be most important, it would be correlated to what kind of impact we think it would have. So I don't know if that's
I don't know if it helps you all, but previously the state board has generally picked 1 or 2 or 3 of their top priorities.
Right.
Because we'll have to put in the additional budget request for the state budget director's process, but generally the state board says, of all these things that are fabulous, or that we would like to see done, these are the top 3 under the budget constraints that we're all facing. So SEEK transportation was, I think, the top priority during the last board's budget session. I don't know if that will make it this time, but Senate Bill 1's obviously in new expenses dedicated to what we have to get in place. But all of these things have been either mandated in statute or things that have been prioritized by the General Assembly to some extent. But you all get to tell us where you want us to try to focus those resources and convince the General Assembly and the Governor's Office will work with us to try to get those priorities built into the budget.
I think that's the most important comment Tracy's speaking to, which is, once we hear your priorities, kind of those top 3, that allows staff here to really advocate in that direction. It's very difficult when you see our big list. It's hard to give equal advocacy to every single one of those, even though they're all needed. So it would be helpful to hear maybe your top 3, as far as we advocate for funding, what that looks like.
So what I was suggesting is that, when do you need that prioritization? Is it in December? If so, could we come back with some information that would help us prioritize that includes impact information or a judgment on impact? If you're asking, should we prioritize now, I think we need to give a little discussion to
Well,
that.
wouldn't it be just as easy as saying, hey, we want, what's going to change graduation rates? What's going to change test scores? Right, or the accountability matrix? And you guys are closer to it than we are. That's what we've been talking about forever. It's not that complicated, I don't think. It's subtle.
Above and beyond the mandated.
Well, so are you saying use those as decision points, basically?
Is what's going to move the needle for Kentucky's economic health as defined by having students being able to participate in our Commonwealth?
Right. So every one of these, I would assume, would not have been put in front of us if the staff did not feel that every one of them has impact on that. So the question is, which ones might have more impact? And I think that's what.
And I don't think we have any way of knowing that.
Or someone's got to get, but then how do you prioritize? How do we say, okay, this is the one we do?
And as Kathy
Someone's gotta
said a
have an
moment
idea.
ago, we won't know for 12 years on some of them.
Exactly.
And
This
so-
is my fear.
Well,
is
I'm
that-
just saying, if you say this is our priority and you got a first grader here, you really won't know for 12 years
Right.
if you made the right decision or not.
Yeah, but of the people who are in line to make those judgments, we're probably looked to as much as anybody else. Even if we can't make a perfect judgment, it may fall to us to set those priorities.
In the past, we've always, and help me, Grace and Nawana, we've always had sort of 2 or 3 that we thought in our legislative agenda, as you said, Tracy, that we thought we got the biggest bang for our buck. Am I saying it correctly? Because like you said, sometimes that is a big decision.
Well, I would think on the transportation thing, funding it 100% would free up money to each individual school system to do what they feel like they need to raise their test scores. And I'd say it'd be up to each individual school. It'd be different for each school system. The second thing that I would recommend would be full-day kindergarten as a priority, because I think that, of course, you wouldn't know until 12 years from now, or 13, whether or not it did any good. But, I mean, I think everybody is in agreement that we need to fund kindergarten and start this process very early, so that those kids will not get behind. When you come into first grade, they're not behind.
Yeah, and I think you could see results at the third grade.
You might, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm saying on a quicker turnaround, because if we get this legislation that if you can't read in the third grade, you won't read.
Right.
Be promoted to the fourth grade. I think, if you could use some of that money, preschool, you'll get a quicker turnaround at the third grade, rather than, you'd be already building up on your foundation to start to move in that gap. That would be my opinion.
Have you heard from districts in the same way that you hear from them about SEEK, as the transportation being high, that full-day kindergarten is also something, or is it more of they're already there?
I think we generally hear that, I think last time transportation for superintendents was their number one priority, so they could free up local revenues that were being diverted into funding transportation costs. And then I think kindergarten has always been high on the superintendent's list also, because I think what we've seen over time over budget is that the state is funded for half-day kindergarten. Most districts have overtime built up and included all-day kindergarten at their own cost. But what we've seen the state do is put more and more funding into preschool, because it's a smaller chunk of money. You can give a $10 million increase to preschool, but to fund all-day kindergarten is a much bigger chunk of change. So they've hit at preschool a lot harder than they have at kindergarten, because it's been a little bit smaller chunks of cash that you can put into another program at a more rapid rate, rather than taking the whole bullet and adding another $133 million to fund all-day kindergarten.
So I'm hearing some priorities for some part of that early education, and what makes the most sense for SEEK transportation. I would throw out there, and then Nuwana, please, but we've also heard certainly support for things that are going to be helping with the CTE and preparation, so perhaps the career advisory as an innovation that we ought to try.
And then
and Nuwana's
KEAT,
next.
which is the Kentucky Education Action Team, made up of all 8 educational organizations in the state and represents 155,000 educators. The first priority is to fund TRS, the Teacher Retirement System. Then the second is transportation, and the third is preschool. There was a big discussion on kindergarten and preschool, and so we stayed with preschool because we've had that as our priority for now about 4 years.
If you believe that the most important thing and the thing we're most likely to fail at both is closing the achievement gap, then the best place to spend the dollar would be any form of
Early.
first grade education, so that you have a more homogenized group coming into the first grade.
I think you're hearing some priorities here. Kathy?
I keep trying to think about this ever-moving discussion about, and Milton, to you, because you keep saying you want solutions, which I love that you say that, that we have a whole bunch of ideas. We can say that it's preschool or kindergarten, or it's transportation, or it's more money for teachers, or, the list appears endless to me about what might be wrong and where we should put our priorities. And what it finally occurred to me we are missing is a signal that both Joe and I had the pleasure and suffering to endure in the marketplace, which is that when we didn't prioritize correctly in our businesses, we saw an immediate response in terms of a reduction in revenue because customers fled. We are missing a huge market signal from parents and students because we don't know what their priorities are. We don't know what students want. So I feel like, I just want to say that when you hear people from the private sector talking, we were disciplined on a daily basis. And we by the market, and we don't have that. And I wish there was a way we could introduce that, because then if we would not have to wait 12 years and spend a lot of taxpayer dollars waiting to see whether or not we got the outcomes that we wanted. And in the meantime, we lost a lot of kids.
And I don't know who the famous quote is, but democracy is messy, and that is the issue. Public schools are, that is our signal, is the voters in the end, and how they're moving legislators for these issues. I think we need to call this to a vote, unless there's any pressing final thing. This would
What
be
about
for
the accountability system and funding that? That's
And I
part
think,
of this.
yeah, I mean, it seems like that's a required.
I think
don't know
big
if
chunks
that's-
of that are tied into the Senate Bill 1 mandates.
Yeah.
Because it's the new
Woven into
standards,
that.
it's the accountability systems with the assessments, it's the test items, it's the, operational subset that has to be released every year. I mean, all of those things are built around the accountability system and what we'll have to do.
Yeah. I mean, the industry certifications are a big deal, and removing this as a barrier would be incredibly helpful. But, if we are ever to get to a place that we have as a graduation requirement that you either have dual credit success or industry certification, no kid can pay for it. I mean, you can't make a kid pay for their own graduation. And so the industry certifications, and to be honest with you, the $6 million could also be an undershot, because this is based on the current kids that are in our current system and taking the median cost of these assessments. But that is a big deal. AP and IB testing, it's been on the law for how long?
Long time.
Long, well, has it been Kara long, or has it been more recent than that?
More recent than that.
So 10, 15 years that we were supposed to be paying for AP and IB testing, which we haven't done. So you want to talk about a direct comeback? We saw this year that if we invested in more low-incomes kids taking AP, they took the test and they performed. So, and this is what's hard, right? I mean, there are so many things, like Kathy said, that we could pick here, and they're all important. And I think that's one of the hardest things about education is it's why I can be in an 8-hour day, be in 12 different meetings about people trying to pull us a different direction, because there's so much that's here. And it's why we need to try to focus in on some specific priorities if
So
possible.
is there a way to get any tangible, your comment about the AP exams, right? Funding those. When we didn't fund them, the number of people that took them went down, right? So there's a very tangible way to measure success, right? Is there ways to do that for the rest of these items?
I don't think it's always that simple, Joe.
Well,
I mean,
even if it's a guess, because a lot of times at this level, there isn't hard facts. You're using your best judgment, right? And maybe numbers are being pulled out, right? But you can say, boy, here's why I think this is important, right? Or, example would be, the transportation. If kids aren't showing up to school, we know they're not going to graduate. If you can change it by 10 or 15%, here's what happens to your graduation rate, here's the payback. Can we, we must have some budget analysts or some number wonks here that can do stuff like that.
So I think I just don't want to keep running
I'll
around,
be
but
quiet.
I think we've addressed that question. That's what if there is a way to do that, we'd like to have that in December in terms of helping with the when the legislative priorities come before us again. Before us right now is, do we accept this or not, or do we change it, the additional budget priorities that are in front of us, so.
Are we talking about the priorities now or the whole thing?
Well, the recommendation from staff was to approve this whole list.
do that.
If you want, we could amend that and say we only are going to pull out 3 or 4 to approve. But that's
I
those are our.
believe the whole thing needs to go. We may want to prioritize the top 3 or 4.
Right.
I do believe the whole
Maybe what
Would
we
you
could
like to
do
put
is
that in a
approve
motion?
this, and then we could
Yeah.
do the prioritization in December after y'all have had some time to think about it. And
And
Yeah.
maybe some additional information.
I will say, just as a reminder, that the greatest growth we've seen in Kentucky was back when SEEK was fully funded. When we went from the very bottom up was back when we did have more funding. So just putting that out there.
So, Mary Gwen, one thing. So technically, when we submit, we have to submit them in a priority order, okay? We just have to. You have to submit something is number one, and something has to be number two, and
forgot
something
about
has to
that.
be number three.
Sorry about that.
It's a system limitation. It's not a Charlie limitation.
And in fact, defined calculations will be number one,
Yeah, it has
because
to
that's
be,
the things that we have to do.
which is part of the budget
So it's
instructions.
just,
But
but,
that doesn't have to be the same priority that Tracy and Kevin and Stephen use to discuss with legislators on issues that they think are most important and can be the best bang for your buck at a district level. Okay? It's the way our board meetings work where we have to do this. We have to be done with your priorities today, and other state agencies, they can wait till the last minute to make those.
And you need that today, that numbered
ma'am.
order.
Yeah, I
In
forgot
order.
about that. Sorry about that.
Well, so our logic is this, what I've heard in the last 5 or 10 minutes of discussion, that early childhood's really important, okay? Whether that's number 1 or 2, I don't know if I've heard that, but it's very important. But I haven't heard maybe some of these other ones, maybe not reach that level of importance.
What I've heard you say is defined calculations has to come first, so
ma'am.
that's just pragmatic.
that's just the way it works.
I think a question for us, next one, what we heard is SEEK. The SEEK transportation is big. If it was funded, it would alleviate a lot of other issues. And that's
Mary
what
Gwen,
the,
I do want to say that
are asking for.
KEAT has that as the umbrella, so they would agree.
Yeah.
and
Early childhood.
then early childhood.
Well, I mean, the thing I'd say, early childhood, though, includes expansion of 200% and full-day kindergarten. Those are two different things. I don't know that those fit right together, 3 and 4 or 4 and 5.
How many things are we allowed to put in as priorities?
As many as we choose.
As many as we want.
So we could literally
We can put
enter all
every-
of these.
all
It's
the-
just that they all have to have a number attached.
Every single one of these can be priority. I would also, just for context again, when you're talking about numbers this size, probably the first 2 or 3 are the ones that you feel most strongly about. The rest of them, does it matter if it's 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 and I'm not trying to minimize or not make them all important. They're all important, but when they're all important, does it really matter if one's 4 and one's 5? Now, your top 3 and how we use those top 3 as we advocate for funding, that's the important part. You're trying to really communicate the message that these are the most important, and in the fiscal environment we're in, I mean, let's all be pragmatic. We're not going to get 14 or 15 additional budget requests. It's not going to happen. So that's why it's important that we just hear your guidance about the first 2 or 3 that are the most important.
All right, on the ones that you got listed under Senate Bill 1, are these, do we prioritize those, or are those just automatic?
So I titled them as, we could have a little leeway there. I titled them as 1, because they're all mandated by Senate Bill 1, and we weren't given funding for them at the time Senate Bill 1 was passed. So they could be one item.
All of them could be one item.
We could
So
consider.
if we do not, let's say we put it in number 5 rather than. They're not going to fund it then, are they? Even though they passed the.
There
all
is
seven?
no way to predict, for me to predict what
Well, I
legislator in
understand
the right spot at the right time
That
thinks
was a bad
something's
way to
important.
phrase that. I
Yeah.
understand that, Charlie.
And once again, this is just a statement to the Office of State Budget Director and the Governor, what this department and this board think are important.
Yeah, they're not gonna necessarily accept our
Correct.
prioritization either.
Right.
The good thing about us is we can put everything on this list that we think are important items. When the governor gets it, he has to balance. Okay, his job is much harder than ours. He has to make this total expenditure request equal the total revenue request. We don't have to do that at the agency level.
So
Okay.
we have two choices, either for us to recommend the top three or to ask for the staff. If anybody would like to suggest a top three, please do so at this moment. That's a board member for a motion.
So this is the top three after the one that are the.
Yeah.
So it's
Right.
really, we want to do 2, 3, and 4.
Yeah.
Right.
Which one's one now?
They,
The
they've got
defined
one.
calculations. They have.
Calculations. Paying the light bill.
Yeah, paying the light bill, that's a good example. Paying our rent.
Unless,
I'd like to go with Seek Transportation is number one and the full-day kindergarten is number two. But now number three, I haven't decided yet. But that's my own personal opinion on it.
I would concur with that.
Gary concurs. Any, do we want to add the SB1 as the third?
I think the testing, the AP and the IB, all that stuff, if it's proven to make a difference, that and certifications, we know the numbers, it's not a risk.
You're gonna have to get accountability in there or it won't be done. You don't get some funding, you won't have a test.
Well, that's true. I mean, we will have to do some major, I mean, the thing, some of these things we can redistribute inside the agency. I can't afford $6 million for industry certifications. That's just, there's just no way to do that. There's no way I can pay for a second college admissions exam. I just don't have it to, you know, the old saying, you can't get blood out of a turnip. Some of the other aspects around accountability, we'll just have, we would have to find a way to make do. I mean, and let's face it, we may be in a situation with this budget cycle, with as bad as everything is, we're going to have to find a way to make do anyway. I mean, it's just a reality.
Which I think goes to the question of, I mean, where would you put these priorities? What would you put as 1, 2, 3, and so forth? Because I think that, since ultimately you're going to be the one to have to figure out how to cut up the pizza, however big it winds up being, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think I pretty much agree with what's been said so far. I would probably break Senate Bill 1 up to be more focused on industry certifications and the AP IB testing, personally. And beyond that, I think it's beyond that, they might as well all be equal, because
Now, you're talking about,
So you're basically not,
you're saying 3 and 4 and not 1 and 2?
or to put them in, what you're saying is mandated to fund some of the unfunded mandates, some of which are Senate Bill 1, but the AP is an older one.
Right,
So
right.
you're saying, put that in as your third priority, is the two big unfunded mandates are industry certs and AP IB.
Well, they are unfunded, but I guess my thing is, those are also areas we know make a difference. You know, and I think all these others will too. It's just a matter of those are the ones that will get the biggest bang for our buck the quickest.
And we would be able to track some result of both of those. You said certifications and testing, so we can.
Well, it's just like the AP just now. You know, we saw almost 14% more kids of low income take it, and almost 14% more had qualifying scores.
Right. So, Joe, to your point then, in both of his priorities, we will be able to measure some kind of outcome, which I suggest we do.
You know, and the other thing I'd add to that too, the assessments, AP, IB, and industry certs, those are part of accountability.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, we have to do those. I mean, we just have to. There's no way around it.
Yeah.
And the ACT, the additional, college entrance exam, whatever college entrance exam we use.
Well, we've got the money for one.
But the second
This is the money for the
administration.
second one,
Right.
which is technically not part of accountability.
Okay.
So the motion is currently shaping up to be, the additional budget priorities all are valid. Our top priorities are seek, after defined calculation, seek transportation, full-day kindergarten. And then unfunded mandates, definitely to include industry certs, AP testing, other assessments that we have to do.
Wouldn't we reverse the order, though, or is that what you intended, Commissioner? To have the certs and testing be 1 and 2, or 2 and 3, and then the transportation and kindergarten be 3 and 4, or 4 and 5?
I don't know, I think I would probably go with the SEEK first, SEEK transportation first.
Okay,
Simply
okay,
because
That frees
if
up-
we are really going to make a difference, it's not going to be just because we're testing them. We got to change how we're doing instruction, and
This has that
this
possibility.
yeah. So if districts have this extra, if they're able to take the money they're currently spending just to get kids to school, to change what they're doing with them after they get them there, I think that's got better potential.
That's really a question of whether we prioritize the use of that money or the
Yes.
local district does. You're gonna give them the money and perhaps they're gonna take it to early childhood or to something else, but it's really a kind of a philosophical question about who decides how that money is used.
Well, and the way our Constitution reads, we are a local control state.
Right.
So that's,
Okay.
you know, it doesn't mean we can't be, and we are, giving some pretty strong guidance and on how we think that should be done. But at the end of the day, it is a local decision,
But do they put in a request for the funds?
not for SEEK. It is a guaranteed,
Just so everybody remembers, the local boards of education are local, but they are state actors, and the Kentucky Constitution provides that funding of state education is an responsibility of the state and ultimately of the General Assembly, as is funding for education.
What's that mean?
It means that at the end of the day, it's a state issue, that the state, the General Assembly, that's why transportation funding and the half-day kindergarten's kind of considered the low-hanging fruit. Those things should have already been funded by the General Assembly years ago, and they haven't been because those are things that happen every day. They're not nice-to-haves, and the Kentucky Supreme Court has said that though the function of providing funding for schools is a responsibility of the state. The problem is, we have a revenue problem.
What about preschool? Can we still consider
We could add-
preschool/kindergarten?
That after, or do one or the other? I think guidance is what is being asked for, though.
well, so again, I think this is a decision y'all can make. There's already preschool funding up to 160%. So the question would be, what's going to be bigger to push for, full-day kindergarten, or to take that next 40% up to 200,000, or to 200%?
If it's an or, then, it's kindergarten. But those children do need
Mhm.
preschool as well. Now, they took part of their funding, which they might, but I don't think we can. It concerns me that we are not making a statement on the importance of preschool when we just say kindergarten.
We could add that as a fourth priority.
Okay.
Behind the testing, okay.
And full-day kindergarten and SEEK. Would anybody like to make this a motion?
If you add it as a fourth priority, you're pretty much crossing it off the list. I don't know what we have a chance to get, but it won't get down to the fourth.
That's right.
Is there no way to put it on the same line, to say preschool/kindergarten as our,
I think the question for us, Luana, is are we being helpful to the staff by doing that, by
So
not
that
giving
is-
them clear?
so are we, or not?
Well, as Ben has said, so many times to really close the gap, we're gonna have to emphasize the whole package of early childhood. And, I know we're trying to shoot in the dark, but if there's a way to word it and get both of them, why not?
So what if we did this? So there's the funding request, and then there's things that we value and find important, right? What if y'all made a proposal about or made a decision about priorities for funding, but we have a set of statements that the board says are priorities in terms of our philosophical view of how to improve education. Preschool being one.
You could argue that there's no difference, that the definition of our priorities is the way we prioritize the funding.
I know, I'm just trying to get us moving. I'm going to be honest with you, it's 4:30, and we got about 8 more items on the agenda. Because here's the thing, I mean, let's just be real. We know the budget situation that we're in. You say we may not get to 4, we may not get to 2.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, and so, and I understand, I'm not trying to diminish the importance of the decisions y'all make, but at the same time, if we debate 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I don't know that we ever get to 2. And so, I mean, one of the things we struggle with, and I guess one of the things I'm sitting here listening, and probably Robin's and Charlie are rolling their eyes, is one of the big philosophical discussions we had internally is, do we come to y'all with everything we need, or do we go with what we think we can get? Well, once the budget reductions came down, we felt like, well, what we think we can get is probably nothing, so let's go ahead and show everything we actually need to improve education. I feel strongly that everything on this list will improve education in Kentucky. But I also recognize that we're under a horrendous pressure with our pension and tax system. So I'm not, I hope you understand, I'm not trying to be flippant about it, but I'm just being real and saying that I'm trying to just help us find a way to move forward, because I'm worried about us spending so much time talking about priorities 3, 4, 5, 6, which I'm hoping we get to 2.
So if I could combine Commissioner's comments about practicality and being real with where our sentiments have been. Seek transportation has consistently come number 1 for us for the various reasons said. We know that we have to meet your issues of integrity as a organization. We have a new accountability system. We must be able to fund these assessments and industry search, things that matter. So I would suggest we put that number 2. And number 3, the full-day kindergarten. And that we have as legislative priorities further discussion and to be included in, among these others, what would be, statements of what we think are going to have the most impact to be part of our legislative agenda.
I think those are a lot more likely.
Commissioner Pruitt, I understand what you're saying, but I also disagree, because I'm going to pull some words out of Milton. He said, what can we do to make a difference? What tangible things can we do? Picking these priorities is the most important thing we can do, because we're saying where the dollars can be spent. And I strongly advocate, right, there's, 60,000 high school kids. If 14% more take the test and 14% more pass, right, you're talking, I'm not going to do the math in my head because I can't. Let's just say 2,000 more people that are now closer to a track for career ready or college ready.
So Joe, are you suggesting we put the number 2 item into number 1?
I'm suggesting
Because we had that in number 2.
The testing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought that was number 3 or 4.
No.
Then I'll just shut up. Sorry.
Now, all I was saying was I don't think us debating number 5 and number 6.
I'll just be quiet.
She said thank you.
I was just saying that if we did debate number 5 and number 6,
Oh, yeah,
we're never going to get there.
We don't need to do that.
And so,
Sorry, I'm very passionate about that one. I apologize.
Madam Chairman, if I be in order, I'll make the motion that we accept those priorities and communicate, as the Commissioner said, the importance of the others.
I have a motion on the floor.
Second.
Second. Do you think you've captured what the priorities are?
Can you repeat them just for my
Three written down.
Seek transportation, number 1. The unfunded mandates, which includes assessments, industry certs, AP, IB, as number 2. and full-day kindergarten as number 3. Do I have a second?
I second.
Grayson, a second?
Either one.
Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. It was a very good discussion, and we will have more when it comes to legislative priorities. I apologize to those, I think some of our group may have already left, the Hope Street group and the
No,
Green-
Hope is here.
KSBA Green
And KSB
are willing to,
Oh, the teachers left?
willing to do it in
Okay.
December. So thank you.
Thank you.
For your efforts, and we look forward to hearing from you in December, and we'll try to do a better job of managing our agenda. So that, do we have further discussion you need from us on the legislative
So it's public.
agenda?
We'll come back in December with an updated look at what you just approved, and the budget priorities will be reflected in the legislative agenda piece as well. If it's any consolation, we received probably a couple of hundred requests for information from the Legislative Research Commission and the State Budget Director's Office, probably more than that during the budget session, on all of these different priorities, and we provide them information and background on every single program that you all have discussed, regardless of what your priorities are. So they will get the full Monty, so to speak, of everything involved with every single one of these programs.
Great. And I think the other thing that you heard a little bit, you heard some suggestions about revenue as being that's important, is that we talk about that. So ideas and, innovations in that arena are also things we'd love to talk further about. So,
Thank you.
thank you. Our next item will be request from Carroll, Gallatin, Henry, Owen, Trimble County School Districts, which comprise the iLead Academy, for a waiver of 704 KAR 3:305, Section 2. And we have Associate Commissioner Kelly Foster, David Cook here, Todd Allen. Who's going to lead us away?
Good afternoon. David is.
Okay.
Hopefully, this will be a very short item on the agenda. This waiver comes from the iLead Academy, who you all have heard from during one of your innovation spotlights. So you're very familiar with the school itself and the work that it does around 5 school districts in what I call the OVEC region, because that's my region. It mirrors a waiver that this board approved several years ago for the Districts of Innovation. And in essence, quickly, the waiver is that once a student has met the transition readiness benchmarks, any one of those academic readiness benchmarks, and has successfully completed the accountability portion high school tests, that at the moment they do that, they are released from the defined set of courses that's required in the high school graduation requirements. Not the number and not but basically what this board has said in the past is these students have proven that they're ready. So it's not a student that's not ready. They've proven they're ready. So let's let them make their senior year be about something that makes more sense to them. Or in the case of iLead, allows them to do some programming that they wouldn't normally be able to do because of the course structure that they have to follow in our current system. So I would say quickly that hopefully we don't bring this waiver to you many more times, because we're working on modifications to the graduation requirements. So, but that's the gist of the waiver. It's for students that are attending the iLead Academy who have met those 2 things: transition readiness, academic part of the transition readiness, and they have successfully completed the high school testing requirements.
Ben?
Does that let them dumb down their senior year curriculum?
No, in this case with iLead, Ben, what it does, it's allowing them to pursue some pathways they couldn't pursue because of the way they had to mess their schedule around as a senior. For they may be taking something like an elective that this allows them to do the things they need to do to complete programs like an AB nursing program, where the academic requirements in English and other areas are different than our traditional English 1, 2, 3, and 4.
But it wouldn't open the possibility of changing from a challenging schedule in their senior year to a bunny schedule in.
No, it wouldn't, Ben, and in fact, what we've done with the Districts of Innovation every year when we go in and monitor those districts, one of the things we do is we pull the files on the kids who were put into that program to see what they're doing their senior year, and they're all, in every single case, they're doing something that's a pathway-driven next step. So they're actually getting to do something they wouldn't have, dual credit, something they wouldn't have gotten to do because the counselor waved their hand and said, oh, I'm sorry, you're missing a 4th English credit, or you're, those kinds of things.
And also, Mr. Cundiff, these requirements are the same that are in statute and regulation for a student to graduate from high school early. So these same students could graduate in 3 years by meeting these requirements and just leave high school
take
for
nothing
their
in their
last
senior
year. But in these situations, they're opting to stay for an additional year to pursue these pathways.
And most, if not all of them, are actually finishing with an associate's degree already.
At least, I don't know if it's fully 30 hours, but they're getting close. Yeah.
So just trying to think about the practicalities of this. Students would still be required to have 4 years of English, but that last year could be a technical writing class.
The great example from this particular, one of the reasons that they brought this waiver, Gary, is that they had this new program, which is an AB nursing program. And that senior year English class is a class about writing, medical writing, as opposed to something they might take in a normal 4th year of English class. So.
Okay.
We've seen such academic success with iLead already, and then your work with the Districts of Innovation. It is an innovation that I think is pretty exciting.
Well, it's one of our ways of thinking about all the different ways we're thinking about competency-based education as well. It's thinking about building the high school curriculum for the student rather than the curriculum being assigned to the student, if you will.
So just to add a little comment too of, when we talked about this with Districts of Innovation, we really wanted to start making this codified so that we don't have to have waivers. So it's very important that all of these pieces get put into that high school graduation review and discussion so that we actually change the system so that we don't need waivers for things like this.
Need a motion?
Yes, we do. Thank you, Grayson.
I'd like to make a motion that we accept the request from Carroll, Gallatin, Henry, Owen, and Trimble County School Districts for a waiver of the 704 KAR 3:305, Section 2.
Do I have a second? Second from Ben?
What did he say?
Say that again.
Any further discussion? Then all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstention? Waiver granted. Thank you. Thank you. Our next scheduled item was to look at the strategic plan. And
We'll delay
Commissioner,
that to December, do it in the context of my goals for the next year.
and I want to say this, it's just important that the staff understands, we know how important this plan is and how much work has gone into it. We have read it. We are wanting to delve into it and give it the appropriate time. But we do have committee meetings, and we have an appeals panel that has to happen today. So we appreciate your forbearance in pushing this back to December.
Madam Chair, I think I'd also like to say that work was stellar. It really shows the kind of strategic plan we need for KDE, and I really commend the work that's been done on this.
Well, it's just a first step. There's a whole lot more to go.
There is, but you've got goals and strategies that I think when we talk about academic success, they're all aimed at improving learning for our students.
Thank you.
And I think what is to come, and which will be available hopefully when we look at it again, are those success metrics that actually, how do you measure that? Some more of that in there, so that will all be useful for us then as well. Right? Okay, then we are going to move to committee meetings. And the Curriculum Instruction and Assessment Committee will be meeting in room 516, conference room 516, with Gary Houchins chairing that. And Ben Cundiff will chair the management committee meeting here in the state boardroom. So we are paused for committee meetings. Turn it over to
Which one am I at?
committee chairs.
What's that? I'll go to 516 then.
It's a good time to stand. Even if you're staying here, I recommend everybody stand up.
Mini meeting didn't excite a lot of people.
Get up and walk around. Can I do this standing up?
Sure, sure.
Thrilled to move the strategic plan in December, less because of
516 's gonna be
time,
on
and
this
more because I got to stand up and walk to the back.
Can I stand up while we do this?
Sorry, I must not have understood. But I can be a little dumb. Next time I'm dumb, you just look up and
There's three of us?
You got a motion, and I second, or I second, and you motion?
It looks like, me like that's what we're doing.
Y'all can swap around, one of you can make
here's
the
one
motion,
thing.
the other one can second it.
I take nothing personally.
I'm kinda disappointed that I didn't get a gavel, but,
Here, I got a coin, we'll flip. Who starts first?
I'll pass it over to you.
Heads, you start, make the first one, and tails, I do.
Leslie?
Tails. So I'll make the motion first time, and then you go second.
if nobody minds, we've got a little scheduling issue, and, we're gonna shift the schedule around and start with the, status update on Breathitt and Menifee counties.
Who's gonna do this one back?
Kelly.
Thank you. I've got 2 items on curriculum, too. So we'll start with Breathitt, and I think the most important thing to say is to congratulate them and their community. They passed the tax, so that very positive move for their school community there, and their staff and community leaders really pushed for that. So congratulations to them on winning that.
I'll be seeing you. Okay.
As far as, what's going on in their district, they're still following their improvement plans, and they'll be going through another management audit the week of November 6th. It's in statute, they have to have one every 3 years, so we'll be going back in the week of November the 6th. But that's really all the updates I
That
have.
include Menifee too, have they been in it 3 years?
No,
Just
they're up for
Breathitt.
the next year.
What about the superintendent, Kelly? How is he?
Philip. So he is in an interim role until June the 30th. And so he is actually participating in the new superintendent's internship program through KASA. And then, of course, Mike Murphy is there with him, daily, mentoring him and coaching him.
Any comments, questions? We'll entertain a motion that we approve those reports as they were delivered.
I so move, we approve.
Have you already said, have you said Menifee?
I haven't said Menifee, but I'll do them real quick. I'll squeeze
Oh,
in here
I'm
real
sorry,
fast.
I thought what you said about Menifee was-
Really, the main update in Menifee County right now is that they made 2 principal changes for the start of the school year. They have a new high school principal as well as a new principal in their K-8 building, and I'm hearing very positive feedback from Tim Spencer, the state manager there, on both of those new administrators in the district. So still moving forward with them. They're not due for a management audit this year, but we will do some instructional reviews in the spring like we had last year to have some comparison.
They did pass the nickel tax. right?
Yes, they've already done that, and they've already located the land to
I hope I wasn't too slow with asking you.
start the work on building a new school.
I'll make a motion, we accept,
Just real quick, what is their financial situation? I mean, since they were so,
Menifee?
Menifee, they have a balance of,
$1 million.
yeah, over $1 million.
Yeah.
And a 9.9
Yeah.
contingency.
77,000.
Yeah, they're doing very well, especially considering where they came from.
And the contingency, what, 9 point, almost 10%?
Mm-hmm. They've made some drastic financial cuts since they went into management. Some smart cuts, I guess I should
Right.
say.
What's
And a really
their-
good, and a
what's
really
their
good
bonding
finance
potential?
officer too.
What's their bonding potential, Menifee?
I don't know that off the top of my head, back in.
Right now, they're just gonna buy the property, and then they're gonna,
Uh-huh.
And, yeah, move forward.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have a motion. Need a
make a
second?
motion, we accept it.
And I'll second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
We got a third one here, he can get in.
Oh, good, we can do all kinds of.
Yeah, we can do all sorts of stuff, yeah.
Thank you.
We'd, I'll leave Robin at her place, and we'll talk about Lincoln County for a second.
Okay, this is a request from the Lincoln County Board of Education for a waiver of 702 KAR 1:160, which is School Health Services, Section 4, School District Health Personnel. That regulation requires a district superintendent to designate a person to serve as a school health coordinator. And the regulation has minimum qualifications for that designation of a registered nurse, a school psychologist, or a school social worker. Lincoln County's tried valiant efforts, and actually the Superintendent Rowe, and Ms. Smith, who is being asked to work with the district to waive this for them, they were both here and were very patient, but they had to get back to the district. So they asked if I would just present on their behalf and answer questions. But they are asking that we waive that regulatory requirement for them for 1 year. The lady they are recommending to be put in this place actually formerly in another district was a school health coordinator for 4 years. It was before we passed the minimum requirements that are under this regulation. So they are asking her to fulfill this role for 1 year. Now, they did have a school health coordinator at one time. That person left them. They then, by September, had filled that position again, so they were working very valiantly to have this position back in place. Unfortunately, that person only lasted for 2 days in the district and left them. So they're at a place where they need someone to act in this capacity. This is more of an administrative coordinator capacity. So this is not a person that's going to be providing medical advice or health services. They actually contract with a clinic, Healthy Kids Clinic, that actually does that for them. So this is a more administrative function for them. We feel, because of the past experience of this Ms. Smith, who has acted in this capacity before, we would like to recommend the granting of this waiver for 1 year. We also have recommended that they actively continue to pursue hiring someone, so they have agreed to do that. And because it's only for 1 year, they would have to come back before you in next year to report the results if they have not filled. So staff here is recommending the approval of this waiver request.
In our normal conference call that precedes this, I think it was Grayson's opinion and mine that it's this or nothing until they find somebody.
You asked about the liability on it, and
Right.
all she would be an administrator. She wouldn't
Right.
be. So,
We couldn't see that there was much alternative to what's being recommended until they find somebody.
well, I recommend we grant the waiver for 1 year for Lincoln County.
That was a motion? I'll second it then.
Yeah.
All right. Any other discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
We have Director Tackett and our own Kevin to talk to us about KHSAA.
Real important stuff, right?
Oh, most important stuff,
Get you in trouble.
athletics.
I'd always better be with you, Mr. Boyd, than sitting on a golf course watching the state golf finals.
We're much more interested.
Yeah.
75 degrees outside.
Really?
Yes, the finals of the boys was
You
today.
didn't need to be there anyway.
No.
I'll turn it over to Julian. KHSAA provides a great service for us and for school districts in reviewing their programs for Title IX deficiencies, and so we get an annual report of their findings for the previous year.
Our audit team finished the last reports toward the end of May and got everything compiled. You have it before you. Nothing alarming at all. Most of the things you even see in a deficiency area, what we're finding now is as the longtime veteran ADs and principals retire, they did a lot of things because it was the right thing to do, but didn't have them written down. Didn't have uniform rotation policies, didn't have weight room rotation policies. So our audit team's finding those, they're correcting that action. There was no uncorrected action from the past year. We have 35 schools to visit this year, and that will complete our third time of going through every school since you all asked us to start doing this in 1999. So we're able to help and guide them a little way without being enforcement. Kevin works very closely with us when we get to somebody that needs a little help.
You're finding now that it's pretty much smoothed out, I mean, as far as
Most of the early
everybody knows what
issues-
they're supposed to do.
Yeah, most of the early issues were facility-related
Right.
or a tremendous leaning toward the boys' teams in uniforms and travel. And that is what we've seen change. The use of charter buses for certain events now. The boards have adopted policies, or school-based have adopted policies where if one makes it, they do the same thing. You know, and they can't help the frequency of their boys' teams making an event more often, but they've got it set up in policy, and it's much better than it was. Certainly an improvement. You all were visionary years ago in requiring that.
Our impression was that most of these things that did get noted were pretty minor, and that not only that, but even though they were minor, the number has been roughly cut in half since last year.
Without question, Mr. Condiff. We're pleased to say that we have very few, quote, repeat offenders. As a matter of fact, this year's 35 includes 4 schools who are doing everything correctly, but they simply don't meet any one of the 3 Title IX tests. And so they get reviewed every year until they finally meet one of them. A lot of times just because they have too many kids and too many programs, they can't do everything.
That's what I was going to ask, Jillian, about that equity or quality of programs. Is that sort of what you were going at as far as boys versus girls?
Yeah, I think and we've tried to encourage them, as you know, Mr. Twyman, it's not a baseball, softball, or girls basketball, boy, it's the entire program. And I think that message has gotten across. They're looking at their whole program. If they do have somebody come in with something really exciting for a boys program, they're looking, where can I do something for the girls to balance? And so it's been a shift in thinking, but it's taken 18 years to do. And the law is only 45 years old, so we kind of remind them, we're a little behind anyway.
Believe me, as a former principal, I know.
Exactly.
Somebody comes in with an idea for a boys' team, you gotta figure out some way to get a girls' team in there somewhere.
The interesting
Which is
dynamic.
it's not bad, that's
No, the
okay.
interesting dynamic we're going to see this year, we do a survey every 3 years about potential new opportunities. Without question, lacrosse will meet the threshold for us to add a championship. It's clearly going to meet the 50 schools necessary on the boys. It's close on the girls.
You got 50 in Jefferson County, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and they finally quit fighting with each other, frankly. The 2 different lacrosse groups have kind of united for wanting a state championship, and that's helping. It's definitely a growing thing.
I think it's great.
What about field hockey?
Field hockey hasn't shown much growth, to be honest, and our boards kind of put the onus on those 19 schools that play. We have a 50-school minimum, but we still do field hockey because the board left a codicil in the policy that if it helps our equity situation, our girls' offerings, we might not require 50. They have shown no growth in the first 4 years since it went statewide, and we're working with them now. Matter of fact, we completed our regional meetings recently, and we've told them, we got people that'll come meet with you, we'll come instruct on it. Field hockey being in the fall, lacrosse being in the spring, we won't see a conflict there. But it's taken a little more education than I think even our field hockey schools thought to get growth. I think they thought when it came under state jurisdiction, there would just magically be another dozen teams. It just hasn't happened.
It's an interesting issue, primarily because of the fact that it's fairly rare. Because of that, it's a good source of athletic scholarships for girls.
Without question, and that's already been there. That's been proven, and yet been something that it's the communities that haven't bought. Our schools, I don't really think, are resisting as much as when they do the surveys every other year of what their kids want to do, nobody's expressing an interest in field hockey. So this being a survey year, we really promoted that a lot at our regional meetings this year to say at least push it. If they say no, they say no. But in our mind, a lot of the stuff I spent the last few minutes listening to you all talk about, we've never needed school sport more than we need it right now for the community and involvement and academic requirements. So we got to find something for every kid. We're exploring an area I never thought I'd see. Exploring an area with esports and e-gaming potentially, supervising the championship. 9,000 people paid last year to go to an event where they watched other people play video games. Wow. That was a different concept to me.
That's raised couch potato to a whole new level.
Well, yeah, that's true. But it also, those companies are looking for those people that can do those things quickly, and all of a sudden they don't have to teach them that the joystick also runs the bulldozer and the backhoe and also runs everything else, so they're-
Drones.
It's an interesting
Yeah.
dynamic, and the coding, the fact that they can use it to try to develop that next generation of coders, because if you can envision the dynamics of that game, maybe you can get Mr. Twyman's package to run better for his particular business. And so it's been an interesting thing to watch.
Our district added archery for boys and girls, and after the fact, we discovered that every single person who participated was not participating in anything else. So it got a different cohort of kids.
Totally different dynamic.
Yeah.
And as you said, Jill, research tells us that a child that's not involved in anything other than going to class, they're most at risk for dropouts and a whole lot of other things.
We've seen that as well.
Any other questions, comments, criticisms?
Good work.
We'll entertain a motion that we approve Director Tackett's report.
Make the motion.
It's Milton's turn to second, I think. All right, all in favor say aye.
Make the motion.
All right, thank you very much. Sorry you had to wait so long to do
No,
that.
it's always educational.
Yeah, one way or the
Always
other.
learn something from Mr. Boyd.
We all
See
do.
you there, Mr. Tackett.
We have Robin and Charlie still hanging on for one more report. This involves the audit of our own beloved KDE.
I feel like I've talked enough. I'm gonna let Charlie just dive into it.
Not without my glasses. So really, it's kind of odd, but the audit update brings good news, which is really good for everyone here. So if you look at the staff note, we'll skip the first few parts and we'll slip down to where it says summary. We always do a review of where we are working with the state auditor's office. And in this case, we have finished up the FY16 SWAC 2 review. And the SWAC 2 is conducted by the Auditor of Public Accounts for Kentucky, and it covers all of our major federal program, which is any federal program we get over $50 million. Our internal controls, our processes, our documents, how we do things inside KDE, basically my staff. And then any question costs we have, like if we had an expenditure that we were supposed to use for a certain program that didn't get coded there. So to fast forward down to the bottom, we didn't have any findings. So that's great news there. We have a audit team that comes to us from the auditor's office of 4 people, and they live here for 8 or 9 months a year, studying our stuff. So,
I can't compliment Charlie and his staff enough. They do a wonderful job when it comes to just making sure that things are done right. A very professional group of people that work really hard. And the best news is they work really hard to keep us all out of trouble. So it's always good to see a big 0 under findings from the Auditor of Public Accounts.
thank you, ma'am. At the top of the second page, it's the first step of SWAC for FY17. And it's the same logic. We have a team from the Auditor of Public Accounts Office who comes and stays with us and looks at, in this case, it's different stuff. They look at our CAFR, our Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. They look at our CFA, our schedule of expenditure of federal awards, is how we spend our federal money. They also look at our IT systems that handle money. That has really been an incredible increase in importance because we have a lot of money and most of it goes out through electronic systems. So we have Munis, which is our school district system. All 173 school districts use that for their accounting program. We have our nutrition and health services. That's around $350 or $400 million in federal funds that provide mostly food to our school districts and some private providers, and as well as SEEK. And we all know SEEK, that's $3 billion that go 100% directly to school districts. Right now, that's in process. If you'll look back at the previous page, we usually have 1 or 2 findings there. They're always minor, and we don't have anything to report at this time. We'll probably do that in April when that process comes out. The next piece is the school district reviews. So we don't audit the school districts, but we make sure that the private audit firms who audit them are doing a good job, okay? So last year, we had 70 findings, 70 districts had findings, and they are called technically
From
deficient.
their local auditors.
From their local auditors, yeah. And they had 70, so all those were considered technically deficient, which is the lowest form of a finding, which is usually record keeping. Usually is record keeping, not always, but usually. And this year, that number was cut from 70 to 30. Okay, so 30 is still too many, but it's a lot better than the prior year. And then out of those 30, subsequent to further conversation with the auditor's office, 13 of those were considered not technically deficient at all. After some clarification in a new federal requirement, GASB 72, which is really talking about how districts invest their money. It's if they account for that properly. So after further review at the auditor's office, they've cleared that up. So really, there were only 17 technically deficient in FY17. And out of those, all 17 have been corrected. They've submitted corrected reports to the department.
Okay.
That's all the good news I have for that.
Anybody have questions on
Good
that?
news.
We're moving in the right direction, it sounds like.
Yeah. Auditor's office is doing a good job. They're good partners with us, and
What you do at the local level is pronounce on the audit that they've had privately, right?
correct.
You just,
They're required by statute to have their own private audit done. And what we do is we come up with the criteria that those private auditors use. And then we check to make sure they used it after it's over.
So there's an audit committee here in state government, and they come up with the standards. We send that out to the private auditing companies that are doing it, and then they use that as sort of like, this is how we do it, to live up to those standards, and we check against that to make sure that they are doing that.
That committee is headed by the Auditor of Public
Yeah.
Accounts.
questions, comments? Motion?
I move that we accept the finding of the report.
Here's a second.
Second?
Okay. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Sir? One small thing left, or two small things. We have two documents that are spreadsheets that are expenditure reports for FY17 for the Board of Education is one of them, and one for the Commissioner's Office. Okay? Those are something you see twice a year, again, just like the audit. And I'll see which one are called up first.
So
That
please-
is the Commissioner's Report. Okay? So if you'll go to the very bottom left of page 1, there's a summary, just right there. That's perfect, thank you. And what you'll notice there in that bottom right-hand corner of that summary is a positive $5,376. So what you'll know is at the beginning of the year, the Commissioner's Office started with a $302,000 budget, okay? That's his salary and operating for his office, okay? And at the end of the fiscal year 17, he had a positive balance of $5,376. So, and then you can see there's a whole lot of data on every expenditure behind there, and then in those columns above are monthly expenses by category.
Do you have questions on that? Okay.
Sounds like he's pretty frugal.
Yeah, so the major change we made with Dr. Pruitt is we've got a state car that's assigned to his office. So the mileage that we get charged is a lot lower than it has been in the past. Really good investment there.
And then you have the same report for the board.
Yes, sir. So we've got the same report for the board. It's organized the same. The expenditure categories along the left and the summary box in the bottom. I'll just have to say that the board did a better job than the commissioner in this case.
Yeah.
They had a budget of $19,000, of $91,000, and had a balance of $16,000 at the end of the year. So the bad thing is we can't carry that forward, and you can use it this year. So we don't get to do that.
So we actually accidentally cut our budget by the required 17%.
Exactly right.
So we done made our cut.
See, you're good team players.
Yeah, we
And if we take Sam Hinkle's suggestion, we might even be better off next year.
That's right, that's right.
Yeah, we have 2 meetings a year.
Yep.
Yeah, that $90, boy, it'll go a long way.
Any questions on that? Now, all the data and all the backup is on that attachment too, but I'm not gonna go with every expenditure that was charged to his account or the board's account. You can see all that.
Questions, comments? motion to approve the report?
I make a motion.
Second.
All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? That passes.
Thank you all a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All I need now is a motion and a second to adjourn this
So moved.
committee.
So moved.
All in favor, say aye, and visit the restroom.
You're right.
Gary, could we have a report of the Curriculum Instruction Assessment Committee?
Certainly.
On your action items.
So on behalf of the Curriculum Instruction and Assessment Committee, I move approval of the following. First of all, revisions to 704 KAR 370. These are changes to the Kentucky Framework for Personnel Evaluation, and a request for an alternative model of school-based decision-making from Atherton High School. They're going to be adding 2 student non-voting members to their school-based council.
This does not need a, I'm just getting a report, right? And then we'll do the vote.
Well,
Doesn't need us.
Yeah.
That doesn't need,
And I'm-
It doesn't need a second,
And I
doesn't
made
need
a
a second, but
motion.
we do need a,
but do have to vote.
and that was your motion to.
That's correct.
So we do not need a second, so if all are in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great, then we will move on to a report from the Management Committee. Ben, your action items, please.
Yep. I move approval of the request by the Lincoln County Board of Education for a waiver of 702 KAR 1160 on school health services. Long story short, each school is required to have a qualified health professional. Lincoln County lost theirs. She retired. They searched mightily and found one who lasted 2 days, and they have a lady who's come back to volunteer who was the school. She filled that role before the requirements were as stringent as they are now, and she does not meet the requirements now, but they haven't been able to find somebody who does, who will work for the available money. So they asked for a 1-year waiver to continue looking and to put this lady in the job, which at Lincoln County is actually an administrative job. It's not a health professional job. And we approved that at the committee, and we move that they be granted this year to clean that up.
Okay. And does that conclude your report?
That's it.
And this also does not need a second, but, so if all in favor of accepting that recommendation, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you very much. Then we will move into board member sharing, which would be the time if there's any news or important things that the board would like to share. This is the time to do it. Well, okay, let's move on. I think we are ready to keep moving, that's what I hear.
This would be a great time to bring a controversial measure to the
Let's just not make it my evaluation.
Okay, so we have a little bit of internal board business to do, and then we will get to your evaluation, Commissioner. So the first is that the NASB Annual Conference is coming up November 1st through 4th, and we have 3 attendees, along with myself, Rich Gimmel, and Wayne Lewis will be coming. Do we need to approve? We've already approved dollars and things, so that's just a notice. If any of you have any specific things you need us to do. While there, we're going to have the visit to Drew Charter School on the afternoon of November 1st, which I'm sorry, I'm actually going to miss that part, but we'll be there for the rest of the conference. We have also coming up in December, our next board meeting. We normally do a holiday dinner before that, and it's a time for us to celebrate together and to we actually usually play a game, doing, what do you call those kinds of gifts?
Dirty Santa.
Dirty
The
Santa.
white elephant, dirty Santa.
Right, fun. So the question is everybody still on board? Do we want to try to do that, have that dinner before, and along with that, the gift exchange? I'm getting some nodding heads.
Yeah.
All
That's
agree?
consensus.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. We'll proceed with that then. the next item we want to discuss is Kevin Brown, our counsel, has received an opinion that wanted to talk to us about times that we go into closed session and some things we should understand about that. Okay.
Ashley Lant is with me. She's in our office, attorney in our office. She's helped me research this issue. This has to do with the executive order that appointing the advisors. And there's some language in the executive order that, and we haven't had this situation come up yet because the board's never had to go into closed session for litigation since the advisors have been appointed. We do distribute attorney-client privilege communication such as the litigation report, so it does apply to that. But the executive order was very clear that the advisors are non-voting. They're to be considered members of the board, and they're entitled to be present at all meetings, including closed sessions, and to be fully heard and participate in all topics of discussion. The issue that comes up from the legal perspective is whether or not the inclusion of the advisors in closed sessions dealing with the attorney-client privileged information, which would be discussing litigation. That probably would not include if you all were to go into closed session to discipline or to talk about the hiring of a new employee, that kind of thing. Or also review of attorney-client privilege communications. If the advisors are included as non-members, does that waive the attorney-client privilege? And so it's a question that needs to be answered. I think that I could probably speak for all of you to know that you don't want to waive your attorney-client privilege, but you also want the advisors to be present with you and to effectuate the executive order. So I requested an ethics opinion from the Kentucky Bar Association's legal ethics hotline, which we're encouraged to do as attorneys anytime we have a question like this. And usually, if you have to ask the question to yourself, that means you need to ask for an opinion. So we got that opinion. And the ethics hotline response was, confirm what I thought. The board, it is your privilege. It's not our privilege as your counsel. It's your privilege, the attorney-client privilege, and we have to abide by it. And as a body, you decide who's in the room in your executive sessions. It's not the attorneys who decide who's in your closed session. You can invite people into your closed session. And that happens a lot with corporate clients. They may, when they're meeting with their attorney, they may invite an accountant into the meeting if they're discussing litigation, if the client or the attorney needs the accountant to further the legal representation. And that is included under the attorney-client privilege. But the attorney-client privilege is waivable. So you can, if you do bring other folks into matters that would otherwise be closed, that could be considered a waiver of the attorney-client privilege. That could also lead to then an argument as to whether or not that could even be in closed session, because then you're saying that it's waived, therefore the general public could come in. But the opinion basically said it's something that we need to raise I need to raise with you, that I need guidance from you as your counsel on how you want to proceed. It can be waived. If it is waived, for example, if you decide that the advisor should be in a closed session discussing attorney-client privilege information, it should be in writing. So the board should say, we want the advisors in this closed session. We would put that in the form of a board resolution. And then the ethics opinion went on to also say, or the letter, that if the board decides to waive that the KB should address any fiduciary obligations of the four advisors. So the members of the board take an oath of office, the advisors do not. You would want to explain to the advisors, if they were in the session, the importance of confidentiality, those types of things. But it's probably not that simple. Ashley has done some research. And we're still doing research on it. We do not need a decision today. I have an obligation to tell you it's a potential issue. We very rarely go into closed session because we have, our litigation is fairly routine and it doesn't require going in for decisions. It probably happens once or twice a year, but it will come up at some point. And I didn't want the point that litigation came up, and we had to go into closed session at 5 o'clock for the board to be confronted with this issue for the first time. So we're continuing to do some research on it, particularly on the area of when clients bring in advisors such as accountants. What are those standards that allows that to happen, and then does that compare favorably to what the role of the advisors to the state board? I don't have an answer for that. Ashley, do you have anything else to add?
Just a little bit of background about the attorney-client privilege. You know, that's something, as Kevin indicated, that you all hold as the client, and that's a privilege. You would be able to refuse to disclose and prevent any other person from disclosing a confidential communication that you had with an attorney that was made for the purpose of facilitating the rendition of professional legal services. So really, when it would come up would be later if a matter did go into litigation. So that's why that's important to address before there's any potential of waiving the privilege, and to the extent it is waived, that's knowingly done so.
Once you've researched it, do you anticipate making a recommendation to us?
Yeah, I think so. I've also spoken with Sam about it because of his background and dealing with it from in the corporate world as far as representation goes. I also have a call into counsel for the cabinet to see if she has anything to offer on it. I think the main thing is to decide to see how comparable the advisors are to others that clients bring in to closed sessions.
Liability, now what'd you say about liability again, Kevin?
Well, the board is covered under an errors and admissions liability policy, which is mandated, or we're permitted to purchase that on your behalf. The department is, and we do so. That does not cover, we did review that policy, that does not cover the board advisors. And that's just something for the advisors to know. I mean, I don't think that liability is going to be an issue, but that's just something for everybody to know. Again, it's not a pressing issue right now. The only other document that really is routinely distributed is the litigation report. That's under the attorney-client section of your portal. The only other time this would really be an issue is when we go into closed session to discuss litigation. The other times you would go into closed session would be to discuss any discipline of an employer, or hiring or dismissal of an employee. So that only happens, you go into closed session when you hire a commissioner, basically, so.
One other question.
Yes, Bill?
If the resolution is in writing, that's a one-time blanket resolution.
It doesn't have to be. You could choose to do that. You could also choose to just say that when the issue arises, we'll make a motion if it's the will of the board to have the advisors in, and we can tell you the ramifications of that, and you can vote and do that, and that could be reflected in the minutes. You could do it that way as well, on a case-by-case basis.
Are there any other questions, comments?
And I'm sorry to, spring this on you, but it's a weedy issue with legal ethics and stuff, but it's something that could arise. I'd rather talk about it and us be thinking about it than having to deal with it when we actually have a piece of litigation we need to discuss.
And the informal opinion that we received said it would be best to raise this sooner than later. So that's another reason to bring it to the board's attention at this point.
Right, well, I appreciate the counsel, and these are things that we would like to be addressing, because you've heard some additional questions that might help. And I think another question to add in the long run is this something that we would want to have clarified by, I don't even know what I'm asking, but by the executive, a change in the executive order, or a change in some legislation, so. Great. All right, well, thank you, appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there additional topics? This is the time for board members to say if there are some additional topics based on today's conversation, things that have been going on that you would like to be sure are addressed in our upcoming board meetings. I'd just like to remind you that there is a survey link that Leslie has sent to us in the past, could send again, and that if we have some ideas, but if there are any now, shout them out. Any,
I like the doodle poll or whatever that she sent out.
Okay.
Just gives you time to think.
great, okay. And are there any other pressing issues before us? And if not, we'll move on to our discussion of the commissioner's self-evaluation. All right, well, that concludes the internal board business then, and we'll do this. I think Rich turned it over to you, Gary,
That's
right?
right. I
To
get the
share on our
privilege.
behalf. And I would just like to mention that I mentioned last night that Roger, I knew was not going to be there, and so I tried to incorporate, but Bill, you were not with us last night, but so if there are particularly things that you'd like to add, please feel free after Gary summarizes for us.
All right, Commissioner, you ready?
I'm ready.
Here we go.
Don't forget, it goes below the fourth rib and then you twist it.
That's right. That's when you twist. That's when you
Thought I
twist.
felt something in there.
No, I mean, I think we just want to start off by thanking you for another fantastic year. And there's so much that we are proud of in this state, progress that we've made, accomplishments that we can point to. I think one of the things that we can be most proud of is the capacity that exists in this room and in this building, in large part thanks to your leadership and the good work that you are doing here. Many of us did not get to be a part of the process that brought you to that seat, but every one of us is very grateful for the work and the discernment that went into that. We're all extraordinarily concerned about our need to make more rapid progress in this state. We're especially pleased that no one is more concerned about that than you are, and we're 100% convinced that you are the man to help us reach those goals that we're striving toward. Thank you. So in terms of talking about some specifics that we want to commend you on, we want to note the great work that you've done over this last year in terms of building relationships. That is one of your strengths. I think that's part of the reason that you're here with us is that capacity to build those relationships. And in particular, the work that you've done in reaching a whole variety of stakeholders. And we've seen this in a number of different initiatives, but probably none more vividly than in the adoption of the new ESSA plan. Very inclusive process, the time that you spent on the road engaging with stakeholders, the work that took place in all of the advisory committees that brought us to a place where we can be really proud of this plan going forward, a plan that has an emphasis on whole child supports, that moves us away from norm-referenced accountability toward a more criterion-based system, and a system that emphasizes transparency. All of these are elements of the new accountability system that we're really pleased with and want to commend you for the leadership that you brought to that. Part of that relationship building is the visibility that you've provided in terms of being out in schools and districts. Really amazing that you have made as many visits as you have, given the amount of work that has taken place here. And we think that is a key, both in terms of you serving as the face of the department, but also the larger P-12 education community. That visibility and that presence, I think, empowers people even further to feel like they have a voice in the process and a seat at the decision-making table. Other specifics that we noted were the development of the new strategic plan. We know that that is still in development, but we believe that's providing a really good framework for helping us move forward. We were really pleased with the staff responses on the annual survey. I know you didn't hit every one of the targets that you'd set for yourself, but when I realized how high the percentages of agreement on some of those items were to start with, that's not a real strong level of concern there. The overall message from staff was that they are very pleased to be working with you and feel empowered to do their work effectively as well. We also want to note how we've made our progress with the science assessment, and knowing that that is a special passion of yours, we attribute some of that progress to your concern. And then finally, the implementation, the adoption of a charter school law, the implementation of that, the development of those regulations, the fact that we got to the point where we were today with so many stakeholders feeling really good about where we go with that next, I think can be attributed to your experience with charters, your positive attitude about it, and your willingness to bring everybody to the table, regardless of how they felt about the issue initially, to try to make good decisions that will benefit us in the long run. So we commend you on all of those accomplishments. I'll note some of the
KSB and KSD.
I was going to ask about KSB and KSD.
Right. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I did, it's right here in front of me. I'm working off of Rich's notes here, so that's his fault. But yes, continued improvements at the School for the Blind and the School for the Deaf. Not just the improvements, but the stability that we feel like has been brought to those programs it's critical and a huge part of our commitment as a board, and so we're grateful for that as well. So we'll note some continued areas of emphasis or things to think about for goals for the future, and then I'm sure other board members may want to contribute some other suggestions or accommodations here. I think probably where I'll begin is in one of the big themes that came through in our discussions last night is that we have many things underway. And I'm going to talk about some of those things that are underway that we want to make sure we keep our eye on and carry those out effectively. But kind of on the bigger picture, the board wants to spend more of its time, and by extension, for you to devote leadership time as well, to giving us an opportunity to talk about specific strategies either at the state level or at a school and district level that really look like they have promise for getting big results.
Okay.
And these would be strategies around innovation, around efficiency, and around closure of the achievement gap. And so I think there's a real strong desire that we be spending more of our time looking at those specific practices and figuring out how we can support those and scale them up wherever it's possible to do that. So that fostering that culture of innovation, efficiency, and so forth. Then in terms of things that are underway that we want to make sure we collectively keep as our priorities, the implementation of the new accountability system is going to be really big. You know, the work that remains to be done on opportunity and access, the conversations that we need to have around essential skills and what that's going to look like, and then a focus on the resources, both material and human, that we're going to need to accomplish to carry out those goals. Same goes for the revision of state standards and the assessments that will go along with that. There's a real pro forma way that we could go about doing that. I don't think that's how you want to approach standards, and it's certainly not how we want to either. We have an opportunity with that standards work to take a good hard look at the role that what we are teaching may be playing in the results that we're getting or not getting. And so we want that to be a really thoughtful and rigorous process. And we think you do too. Obviously, continuing that implementation of charter schools as we get these regs finalized and we get that out there, we feel like you've made a great choice in Earl and his leadership and helping that division get going and be successful. The work around high school graduation requirements. We had a good deal of conversation about the importance of that as it unfolds over the next few years. The linkages between graduation requirements and our goals of promoting career and technical education, in particular, dual credit, apprenticeships, and even those connections to the whole child and student health and wellness there's all of those fit in one way or another to that whole issue of graduation requirements. Just a couple of other things. Obviously, we want to keep moving forward with the strategic plan. We're looking forward to more conversation about that at our next meeting. As we've noted many times today, our concern about early childhood education and any ways that you can help us keep our focus on that and support the work of the department in advancing that goal. And then finally, to kind of continue the good work that you already do with relationship building. We think that that's going to be really critical in continuing to foster relationships with legislators and officials in the administration. Had some good discussion about that and how building those strong connections and lines of communication will not only help lawmakers and folks in the administration feel like they have a seat at the table with us, but also puts us in a position to be able to say to them, hey, now here's what we need to make all of this work. So we think that's going to be really critical. We want you to continue with those regular meetings to build linkages to career tech and to industry and the workforce, and maybe even think about some outcome or success metrics from those specific kinds of relationships, so that we could say, here's the payoff that we're working toward as a result of establishing those connections. The only other thing here that I'll mention that is more back in the category of implementing things already underway, we know there is a major management audit going on in one of our largest districts. We know that's going to potentially come with difficult decisions and an awful lot of necessary oversight and follow-through on the part of the department. We want to commend you for the work that you've done on that already and make sure that that gets followed through on in a really efficient and successful kind of way.
Great.
Before I offer Commissioner a chance to respond to that, Bill, was there anything that you'd like to add?
So I know the Commissioner and I have talked many times, but I would like to include on that a continued effort, and I know your constraints, but a continued effort as far as working on diversity, because that our student population is not getting less diverse; it's getting more,
Right.
and our staffing and you know, if you see opportunities, I would like to see. I hope the board does to see that effort followed up on.
Me too.
Any additions or?
I may have missed this, Gary, when you talked about strengths, the accountability system and the development of that accountability system was just amazing in this state. And your collaboration with shareholders and your appointing of chairs that were superintendents in the districts, I think has brought everybody ownership. It's been excellent, and we've moved light years, I think, because of what you've done. So that is a great strength. And then Gary beautifully talked about what we need to do now.
I bet that's his science background, performance.
Stephen, do you have some thoughts and reactions?
The biggest thing I can ever say is thank you. Every night I go to bed and I say a prayer of thanks that I get to do this every day. I appreciate the kudos. For me, it's more about what I need to continue to work on. I'm never going to be perfect, and if ever I think I am, I hope that I quit, because I know we've got tons of stuff to do. I'm going to continue to bang the drum and fight the achievement gap. That's going to be my number one thing always, and I think most of the things that you listed there really kind of roll up into that. But I just appreciate I appreciate all of you. I appreciate how much you make yourselves accessible. I am my biggest regret, I guess, is that I don't get to spend as much time with you, sometimes even by phone, as I would like, because my job's a little weird sometimes. And to be honest with you, sometimes by the time I get in the car to go home, I can't think to have another conversation. I've passed a lot of levels on Candy Crush, and it's just simply because by the time I get home, I can't read another thing. But I walked in here, it'll be 2 years, October 16th, and I am every bit as honored and appreciative of getting this opportunity as I was the day I got here. So I appreciate y'all and appreciate the good feedback. I'll work with Rich to develop my goals and bring that back to you in December, and we're going to have a good year. Hard year, but it'll be a good year.
So I think one of the other themes that was expressed last night was in this time of, when there's going to be some very difficult choices, it's just going to be even the more important for you to exercise leadership in providing the priorities to us, to helping us understand what the choices we have to make, what the implications are, and to be unafraid to, that we encourage you to take the risks you're going to have to take to make those difficult leadership decisions with all, I think Joe said something, yes, we've got good relationships, but don't be afraid to step on toes too, so.
That doesn't bother me.
Right.
But when you got the relationships, the toe stepping is
And
a little bit easier.
And specifically in, identifying and championing the resources that are going to be needed to keep in mind that the greatest impact on our children is that quality teacher, the quality administrator, and so that we are doing the things also to make sure that they're, that we can secure that for our students. So.
Yep.
Any other thoughts or additions? The process here is that this will be formalized into a letter that we'll all get a chance to look at and weigh in one more time. That then would become a formal evaluation for you in December that would be matched with your, the goals and for the next year that you bring back to us. That will include those metrics that we keep talking about, so. Any other questions or comments? And I think that was it that we need to do for that then, right? All right, thank you all for that last night, participating in that and staying late for this today too. I think I'm looking for a motion to adjourn.
I'll make that motion to adjourn.
Grayson, second from Elisa. All in favor?
Run to your cars.
Any against?
I'm opposed.
Thank you all for.
You opposed?
We're going to have to figure out how to add these things into
See how many
the
things I
calendar.
get thrown at me.
Evaluation Appeals Panel in room
We'll do
516, I
that.
believe.
Oh, gosh.